Welcome. Find yourself somewhere comfortable this evening and allow yourself to settle in. Tonight, we're going to take a journey together back through nearly 2,000 years to explore one of history's most fascinating culinary worlds. We'll walk through the kitchens of ancient Rome, meet the people who created extraordinary dishes, and discover foods that would seem utterly alien to our modern palates. This is a story about food, yes. But it's also a story about power, about labor, about the vast gulf between the privileged and the powerless. It's a story told through fermented fish sauce and flamingo tongues, through the smoke-filled rooms where slaves toiled, and the elegant dining halls where senators reclined. And it's a story that, in its own way, helps us understand how very different the ancient world was from our own comfortable present. So breathe deeply, let your shoulders relax, and prepare to step back into a world where the simple act of preparing a meal could mean the difference between life and death, where a condiment made from rotting fish was worth more than wine, and where the ultra-wealthy poisoned themselves rather than face moderate prosperity. Let's begin where all meals begin, in the kitchen. Imagine, if you will, that you wake in darkness. Not the comfortable darkness of a quiet bedroom, but the thick, oppressive darkness of a windowless chamber deep beneath a Roman villa. The air is already warm, carrying with it the lingering smell of yesterday's cooking fires, the sharp tang of fermented garum, and the earthier sense of unwashed bodies packed into a small space. You are a cocus, a kitchen slave. And your day is beginning as it always does, hours before the sun will crest the hills of Rome. Around you, other slaves are stirring. There's no gentle waking here, no gradual transition from sleep to consciousness. Someone, perhaps the villicus or the head cook, has already moved through the sleeping quarters, rousing everyone with sharp words or sharper prods. Your back aches, a dull, constant throb that has become so familiar you barely register it anymore. Yesterday, you moved too slowly when the master's cousin arrived unexpectedly for dinner, and the head cook's rod found your shoulders. The welts are tender, but you've learned not to show pain. Showing pain only invites more of it. You rise from your sleeping mat, thin and worn, spread over the bare stone floor. In the dim light of a single oil lamp, you can see perhaps 8 or 10 other kitchen slaves, all moving with the same weary efficiency. There is no conversation, not yet. The early morning hours demand silence and speed. You splash tepid water on your face from a communal basin, the water already murky from those who woke before you. And then you make your way through the narrow corridor toward the kitchen proper. The kitchen of a wealthy Roman household is a world unto itself, carved into the foundation of the villa, partially underground to keep the heat from disturbing the family's living quarters above. As you enter, the temperature rises noticeably. Even at this early hour, before the main cooking begins, residual heat radiates from the brick ovens built into the walls. These ovens, fired by wood and charcoal, will burn throughout the day, and the heat they generate is both essential and punishing. Your first task, as always, is to stoke the fires. You kneel before the main oven, feeling the rough brick scrape against your knees, and carefully add small pieces of wood to the glowing embers from the previous day. The fire must be coaxed back to life gradually, thoughtfully. Too much wood too quickly, and you'll create excessive smoke. Too little, and the oven won't reach the necessary temperature for the morning's bread. As you work, smoke begins to curl upward, and despite the small opening designed to vent it, the room fills with a hazy grey veil that makes your eyes water. This smoke is your constant companion. The kitchen has no real ventilation to speak of, just a few small openings high on the walls that do little to clear the air. By midday, you'll barely be able to see from one side of the room to the other. By evening, your lungs will ache with each breath, your throat roar from inhaling the acrid fumes of burning wood, smoldering fat, and the strange, pungent vapors that rise from pots of boiling garum and reducing sauces. But the fires are only the beginning. As dawn breaks somewhere above you, painting the sky in colors you won't see today, the kitchen begins to truly come alive. The head cook, Cassius, arrives, a freedman who earned his liberty through culinary skill and now rules this underground domain with absolute authority. He's not a cruel man by Roman standards, but he's exacting. His reputation, and thus his livelihood, depends on the meals produced here, and he has no tolerance for error. Cassius surveys the kitchen with a practiced eye, mentally organizing the elaborate breakfast the master has requested. The Dominus is entertaining a business associate this morning, which means the meal must be impressive, but not so extravagant as to suggest desperation or nouveau riche ostentation. It's a delicate balance, one that Cassius understands instinctively, but that you, as a mere kitchen drudge, are not privy to. Your assignment today is grain grinding. You suppress a groan. Of all the kitchen tasks, this is among the most physically demanding. You make your way to the heavy stone quern, a hand mill that has ground grain for this household for years. The process is brutally simple. Coarse grain is poured into the upper stone, and you must rotate it over and over while applying downward pressure. The grain filters through the stones, gradually breaking down into flour that collects in a wooden bowl beneath. The work is monotonous and exhausting. Your arms begin to ache within minutes, a deep, burning sensation that spreads from your shoulders down to your wrists. Sweat beads on your forehead despite the early hour. The motion is repetitive, circular, endless. Around and around, the stone grinding against stone, the sound a constant gritty whisper. You lose yourself in the rhythm of it, your mind drifting to thoughts of the life you had before you were enslaved, memories that grow hazier with each passing year. You were born free in a small village in Greece that the Romans conquered when you were still a child. You remember your mother's face, just barely, and the sound of her singing. You remember olive trees and the brilliant blue of the Mediterranean. Then came the soldiers, the burning, the long march in chains, the slave market in Rome where buyers examined you like livestock, checking your teeth, your muscles, your reflexes. You were young and strong then, and a slave trader who specialized in domestic servants purchased you, trained you in basic household skills, and eventually sold you to this household. How long ago was that? 10 years? 12? Time blurs in the unchanging rhythm of servitude. A sharp command from Cassius pulls you from your reverie. You've ground enough flour. Now you're needed for other tasks. You brush the fine white powder from your hands and tunic and move to the preparation tables. These are massive wooden surfaces, scarred and stained from years of use, never quite clean, no matter how much scrubbing you do. Today's menu requires fish, and several large specimens lie on the table, their scales glinting dully in the lamplight. You're handed a knife, the blade worn thin from countless sharpenings, and you begin the work of gutting and cleaning. The smell is immediate and overwhelming, that particular scent of raw fish, salty and marine. Your hands work quickly, efficiently. You've done this thousands of times. The knife slips beneath the scales, peeling them away. You make the necessary cuts, remove the innards, and toss them into a large ceramic jar designated for waste that will later be processed into garum. Nothing in a Roman kitchen is truly wasted. The fish heads and bones will be boiled down for stock. The entrails will ferment into the prized fish sauce that flavors nearly every dish. Even the scales might be used, dried and ground, for some purpose you've never fully understood. As you work, other slaves bustle around you, each attending to their assigned tasks. One tends to the bread dough, kneading it with strong practice movements. Another chops vegetables, the knife creating a rhythmic tapping against the wooden cutting board. A younger slave, perhaps 14 or 15, struggles with a side of pork, trying to break it down into manageable portions. His inexperience shows, and you can see Cassius watching him with growing impatience. The hierarchy in the kitchen is clearly defined and rigidly enforced. Cassius stands at the top, unquestioned in his authority. Below him are the specialized cooks, slaves who have demonstrated particular aptitude with sauces, baking, or meat preparation. These slaves have marginally better treatment, slightly more food, and the grim satisfaction of knowing their skills make them valuable. Then there are slaves like you, competent but unremarkable, capable of any task but master of none. And at the bottom are the newest slaves, the youngest, those still learning, who receive the hardest, dirtiest jobs and the harshest punishments for their inevitable mistakes. You watch as Cassius approaches the young slave struggling with the pork. The boy's hands are slick with fat and his knife work is clumsy. Cassius doesn't shout, doesn't rage. He simply takes the knife from the boy's hand and demonstrates the proper technique, cutting through a joint with practiced ease. Then he returns the knife and watches. The boy tries again, does better, but still not well enough. Cassius's face hardens. He strikes the boy across the face, a single sharp blow that sends him staggering. Again, Cassius says, his voice level, "Until you learn." The boy's eyes well with tears, but he blinks them back and returns to his work. You continue with your fish, keeping your gaze down, grateful that today's mistakes belong to someone else. This is the nature of life here. You survive by being competent, by being invisible, by never giving anyone reason to single you out. The morning progresses, and the heat in the kitchen becomes oppressive. The fires roar in the ovens, and pots bubble on iron trivets positioned over open flames. Steam rises from simmering stocks and sauces, adding moisture to the already thick air. Your tunic clings to your back, soaked with sweat. The kitchen slaves are all stripped down to the minimum, tunics pulled up and tied to allow for some cooling, but it's never enough. You move from task to task as directed. After the fish, you're assigned to sauce preparation, a task that requires constant attention. You stand over a bronze pot, stirring a reduction of wine, honey, and herbs. The mixture must be watched carefully, stirred constantly to prevent scorching. The bronze handle of the stirring spoon grows hot in your hand, and you shift it frequently to avoid burns. Burns are an occupational hazard, a constant threat. Your forearms bear the scars of past accidents and carelessness, small white marks where hot oil splattered or where you misjudged the heat of a pot handle. Serious burns, the kind that blister and weep and refuse to heal, are common among kitchen slaves. You've seen infections set in, watched as a fellow slave's hand swelled and reddened, then turned black. He died screaming, fever burning through him, and was replaced within a week. There is no medical care for slaves, not really. Minor injuries are expected to heal on their own. Major injuries often mean death or, if you're lucky, being sold off to a less demanding household or even freed out of a master's mercy, though such mercy is rare. The Romans are not needlessly cruel by their own standards, but they are practical. A slave is an investment, yes, but a replaceable one. The markets are always full of new captives from the empire's endless conquests. As the morning stretches toward midday, the kitchen's activity reaches a crescendo. The breakfast you've all been preparing must be assembled and sent upstairs. Platters are arranged with meticulous care. The fish you cleaned, now grilled and dressed with a complex sauce. Bread fresh from the oven, its crust golden and fragrant, fruits and cheeses artfully displayed, and small delicacies, oysters and sea urchins, still glistening. You watch as the serving slaves, a different category entirely, dressed in cleaner tunics and with more presentable appearances, carry the dishes up the narrow stairs toward the dining room. You will never see that room. You will never taste the food you've prepared, not as it's meant to be eaten. Your meals are taken in snatches, stolen moments between tasks, leftover porridge from yesterday, a heel of bread too stale for the master's table, perhaps some of the fish too small or damaged to serve. You eat standing up quickly, and then you return to work. The Dominus and his guest are eating now, reclining in comfort, being entertained by musicians, discussing business deals worth thousands of sesterces. Meanwhile, you begin the next round of preparations. There will be lunch to prepare, a lighter meal, but one that still requires attention. And then dinner, the cena, the main meal of the day, which will demand hours of labor and every skill you possess. Your day will stretch on for 16, perhaps 18 hours. You will lift heavy pots, breathe smoke, risk burns and cuts, and endure the constant pressure to be faster, better, more efficient. You will ache in every muscle, your hands wrinkled and softened from constant immersion in water and oils. And at the end of it, you will descend once more to that windowless sleeping chamber, collapse onto your thin mat, and sleep the heavy, dreamless sleep of exhaustion. Then, in what feels like moments, you will wake again in darkness, and it will all begin anew. This is your life. This is the reality for thousands upon thousands of kitchen slaves across the Roman Empire. Anonymous laborers whose skill and suffering make possible the legendary feasts of Roman high society. You create culinary masterpieces, dishes that guests praise and remember, meals that enhance your master's reputation and open doors to political advancement and business opportunities. But you receive no recognition, no praise, no share in the glory. Your value is purely economic. A skilled kitchen slave can fetch a high price at market, especially one trained in the elaborate techniques of Roman haute cuisine. Your master paid perhaps 2,000 sesterces for you, a significant investment, but one that has paid dividends. Your labor has saved him the cost of hiring free cooks, and your skills have improved his social standing. If he chose to sell you tomorrow, he could likely get 3,000, perhaps more. Your suffering has, quite literally, increased your market value. But that value doesn't translate into freedom, not usually. Some kitchen slaves do earn their liberty, particularly those like Cassius, who demonstrate exceptional skill and loyalty over decades. But for most, slavery is a lifetime sentence. You will grow old here, your body breaking down from years of hard labor until you're no longer useful. Then, if you're fortunate, you might be quietly freed, left to fend for yourself in a world that has little use for aging former slaves. If you're less fortunate, you'll simply be sold off, passed from household to household as your value diminishes, until you die forgotten in some other master's kitchen. And if you make a significant mistake, the punishments are severe and escalating. Minor errors earn beatings, the rod or the whip applied until the lesson is learned. More serious transgressions might result in being sold to the mines, a death sentence disguised as punishment, where you would labor in darkness even more complete than the kitchen, hauling ore until your body gave out. The worst offenses, running away or striking a free person, could earn crucifixion, that prolonged and agonizing death the Romans reserved for slaves and enemies. So you are careful, you are compliant, you survive, but the food you create, that food is genuinely extraordinary. The sauces you prepare are complex, layered, sophisticated. The dishes you help assemble are beautiful, even artistic. Roman cuisine at its highest level is one of the ancient world's great achievements, drawing on ingredients and techniques from across the vast empire. And it all flows from these underground kitchens, from the skilled and suffering hands of people whose names history has largely forgotten. Let's leave this hot, smoke-filled kitchen for a moment. Let's ascend those narrow stairs, emerge into the light and air, and meet someone whose name was not forgotten, a man whose obsession with food was so extreme that it killed him, but whose influence on cooking would last for centuries. We emerge now from the basement kitchens, from the world of labor and smoke, and step into the sunlit realm of Roman high society. Here, in the early decades of the 1st century of the Common Era, during the reign of the Emperor Tiberius, there lived a man whose name would become synonymous with culinary excess, with innovation, and with the peculiar madness that sometimes afflicts the very wealthy. His name was Marcus Gavius Apicius, and his story is both fascinating and deeply strange. a window into a world where food was not merely sustenance or even pleasure, but an obsession that consumed fortunes and, ultimately, a life. Let us begin by understanding what Apicius was not. He was not a professional cook. He never labored in a kitchen, never felt the heat of the ovens or the sting of burns on his hands. He never ground grain or gutted fish or stirred sauces for hours until his arm ached. He was not like Cassius, the freedman cook we left behind in that underground kitchen, whose skills were honed through years of practice and necessity. No, Apicius was something else entirely. He was a Roman aristocrat, a man of immense wealth, an epicure whose fascination with food transcended the normal boundaries of appetite and entered the realm of artistic obsession. In the social hierarchy of Rome, Apicius occupied a position near the top. Not at the very pinnacle, perhaps. He was not an emperor or a senator of the first rank, but wealthy enough that money seemed, for most of his life, an inexhaustible resource. His family had accumulated riches through the usual means available to Roman elites: land holdings, business investments, perhaps military service in earlier generations. By the time Marcus Gavius Apicius came of age, the fortune was simply there, a vast pool of sesterces that seemed to have no bottom, and he spent it on food. Not simply on eating well, you understand. Many wealthy Romans ate well. That was expected, almost obligatory for one's social standing. But Apicius took this to extraordinary extremes. He didn't just consume fine food, he studied it, experimented with it, pushed the boundaries of what Roman cuisine could be. He was, in a sense, Rome's first food scientist, its first culinary innovator in the modern sense of someone who approaches cooking as a field worthy of serious intellectual attention. Consider one of his most famous experiments, one that ancient writers recorded with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. Apicius had a theory about pig liver. He believed, or perhaps simply wondered, whether the flavor of the liver could be improved by altering the pig's diet before slaughter. This wasn't an entirely novel thought. Farmers had long understood that an animal's feed affected its meat, but Apicius approached the question with systematic determination and unlimited resources. He ordered his slaves to feed selected pigs a diet of dried figs and honeyed wine. Imagine the expense of this. Honey was costly, wine even more so when given to animals rather than consumed by humans. And this wasn't for a single pig, a one-time experiment. Apicius maintained this practice for multiple animals over extended periods, testing and refining his technique. The pigs, one imagines, lived rather well by porcine standards, gorging themselves on sweet figs and growing fat and content on wine-soaked grain. When these specially raised pigs were slaughtered, their livers were indeed transformed. The organ was fattier, richer, with a unique sweetness and texture. Apicius had, through this extravagant process, created something that would centuries later be recognized as a precursor to foie gras, that controversial delicacy of force-fed duck or goose liver. His version was different in method and perhaps in taste, but the principle was the same: manipulating an animal's diet to create a luxury food item prized for its rich, fatty texture. Word of this innovation spread through Roman high society. Other wealthy families attempted to replicate it. Dishes featuring Apicius's special liver appeared at important banquets. And Apicius himself gained fame, not as a cook, but as a culinary visionary, someone who thought deeply about food and was willing to spend lavishly to pursue his ideas. But the pig liver experiment was just one example. Apicius's culinary obsessions ranged far and wide, encompassing ingredients from across the known world. He became particularly interested in seafood, and one story about him reveals both his dedication and a certain charming absurdity. Apicius had heard tales of prawns found off the coast of Libya, near the ancient city of Cyrene. These prawns were, according to reports, of exceptional size and flavor, surpassing anything available in Italian waters. Most people, hearing such a story, might express mild interest or regret that they couldn't try these legendary prawns. Apicius chartered a ship. Picture this, a vessel provisioned and crewed, setting sail from Italy, crossing the Mediterranean to the North African coast, all in search of prawns. The journey would have taken days, perhaps weeks, when accounting for weather and navigation. The expense was considerable. The ship itself, the crew's wages, provisions for the voyage, fees for harbour access, and all the incidental costs of such an expedition. The ship arrived at the Libyan coast. Local fishermen, alerted to the presence of a wealthy Roman willing to pay premium prices, brought forth their finest prawns. Apicius examined them carefully, perhaps had them prepared according to his specifications. He tasted them, considered, deliberated, and then he declared them inferior to the prawns available in Rome. Without purchasing a single prawn, without any of the cargo he had ostensibly come to acquire, Apicius ordered the ship to turn around and sail home. The entire expensive expedition had been, by his assessment, a failure. The fishermen of Libya were left bewildered, and Apicius returned to Rome, having satisfied his curiosity, but having also spent a small fortune to confirm that his local prawns were, in fact, perfectly adequate. This story circulated widely in Rome, and reactions were mixed. Some found it amusing, a harmless eccentricity of the very rich. Others saw it as emblematic of aristocratic wastefulness, the kind of casual expenditure that seemed obscene when so many Romans lived in poverty. But for Apicius himself, it was simply research, an investigation into the possibilities of cuisine that required first-hand verification. His reputation grew. He was invited to the finest banquets, not merely as a guest, but as a consultant, someone whose opinion on food carried weight. He developed a following of sorts, younger aristocrats who admired his dedication and sought to learn from him. And so Apicius did something unprecedented. He established what might be called Rome's first cooking school. This wasn't a school in the formal sense, not an institution with permanent buildings and enrolled students. Rather, it was a more informal arrangement. Apicius would invite interested parties to his home, where his kitchen slaves, highly trained specialists he had purchased at premium prices or had trained himself, would demonstrate techniques, while Apicius provided commentary and instruction. The students were not learning to cook with their own hands. That would be beneath their dignity as free Romans of good family. Instead, they were learning to direct their own kitchen slaves more effectively, to understand the principles behind various techniques, and to develop the discerning palate necessary to appreciate fine cuisine. The curriculum, if we can call it that, covered a range of topics. There were lessons on sauce making, that most essential of Roman culinary arts. A proper sauce could transform a simple ingredient into something magnificent, and Apicius had developed numerous variations, each suited to specific meats or fish or vegetables. There were demonstrations of preservation techniques, methods for keeping oysters alive and fresh during long journeys from the coast, or for storing other delicate ingredients. There were discussions of flavor combinations, the ways that sweet and savory could be balanced, how garum's pungent saltiness could enhance rather than overwhelm, where exotic spices should be employed, and where simpler seasonings were more appropriate. Some of what Apicius taught was traditional, techniques passed down through generations of Roman cooking, but much of it was innovative, his own experiments and refinements. He had, through years of focused attention and unlimited resources for trial and error, genuinely advanced Roman cuisine. His influence began to permeate the dining culture of the capital's elite. Dishes were created and named for him, recipes beginning to be designated as Apician in style, meaning they involved particular techniques or flavor profiles he had popularized. But then there was the matter of the cookbook. At some point, either during Apicius's life or in the years following his death, a collection of recipes was compiled under the title De Re Coquinaria, which translates roughly as On the Subject of Cooking, or Concerning Culinary Matters. This collection, which survives to the present day in various manuscript versions, contains nearly 500 recipes, covering everything from sauces and vegetables to meats and seafood. It is the only complete cookbook to survive from ancient Rome, and it bears Apicius's name. But did he actually write it? The question has occupied historians and food scholars for generations, and the answer is uncertain. The text itself offers few clues to definitive authorship. Some of the recipes are fairly simple, the kind of everyday dishes that seem beneath the notice of someone as obsessed with luxury as Apicius. Others are elaborate, expensive, and align perfectly with what we know of his style. The language is practical, instructional, written for people who would be directing slaves rather than cooking themselves. And some passages seem to reflect multiple hands, different writers or compilers working at different times. The prevailing scholarly view is that De Re Coquinaria is a compilation. Perhaps Apicius did record some of his favorite recipes, his innovations and discoveries. Perhaps his students or admirers gathered these after his death. Perhaps professional cooks, aware of his fame, attributed their own recipes to him to lend them prestige. Over time, through successive copyings and additions, the text grew into the collection we have today. It's attributed to Apicius not because he personally wrote every word, but because his name had become a brand, a seal of quality and sophistication in Roman culinary culture. Regardless of the exact authorship, the cookbook is invaluable. Through it, we can see what Roman haute cuisine actually looked like. We can read instructions for preparing dormice stuffed with pork and pine nuts, or recipes for sauces involving improbable combinations of ingredients, honey and vinegar, wine and garum, exotic spices from the far edges of the empire. We can see the Romans' love of layered flavors, their willingness to combine sweet and savory in ways that modern palates might find startling. And through these recipes, we can glimpse something of Apicius himself, or at least the culinary philosophy associated with his name. There's an adventurousness here, a willingness to experiment. There's also an assumption of abundance, of access to expensive ingredients without concern for cost. And there's a focus on spectacle, on creating dishes that would impress guests, not just through taste, but through elaborateness and rarity. This brings us to the end of Apicius' story, and it is a strange and rather dark ending for a man who devoted his life to pleasure. Apicius lived extravagantly. The pig liver experiments, the ship to Libya, the cooking school, the constant entertaining and elaborate banquets, all of this required enormous expenditure, and even a vast fortune, when attacked with sufficient determination, can be diminished. By the time Apicius reached middle age, his wealth, while still substantial by any reasonable measure, had decreased noticeably. According to the Roman writer Seneca, who recorded this story with a mixture of fascination and moral disapproval, Apicius eventually found himself in a position where he sat down with his accountants and calculated his remaining assets. The figure they arrived at was approximately 10 million sesterces. To put this in perspective, a Roman legionary, a professional soldier, earned about 900 sesterces per year. A skilled artisan might make somewhat more. A comfortable middle-class existence might require 5,000 to 10,000 sesterces annually. 10 million sesterces was enough money to live very well for multiple lifetimes. It was enough to maintain a household, to eat good food, to enjoy comfort and security until old age. For the vast majority of Romans, it would have represented unimaginable wealth. But for Apicius, who had grown accustomed to a certain level of expenditure, who had for decades spent without meaningful constraint, it represented poverty. He apparently calculated that at his current rate of spending, This fortune would be exhausted within a few years. And then what? He would have to economize. He would have to decline invitations to banquets because he couldn't reciprocate with equal magnificence. He would have to dismiss some of his slaves, reduce his household, live more modestly. He would still be wealthy by normal standards, but he would no longer be able to live as Apicius, the legendary epicure, the man for whom no culinary expense was too great. This prospect was, to him, unbearable. And so Apicius made a decision. He would throw one final banquet, a magnificent farewell, bringing together friends and admirers for a meal that would be remembered. And at the end of that banquet, he would take poison. We can imagine that final dinner, though the historical sources give us few details. The guests reclining in his triclinium, the dining couches arranged just so. Course after course emerging from the kitchen, each more elaborate than the last. Perhaps some of his signature dishes appeared, the fig-fed pork liver, prawns prepared in his special style, sauces of impossible complexity, wine flowing freely, conversation and laughter, the warm glow of oil lamps, musicians playing in the background. Did his guests know what he planned? Did they suspect, as the evening wore on, and Apicius became increasingly withdrawn, or perhaps unnaturally jovial, that something was wrong? Or did he hide his intentions completely, playing the gracious host until the very end? At some point, after the last course, after the final farewells, Apicius consumed poison. The sources don't specify what kind, hemlock perhaps, or some other toxic preparation. The death would not have been pleasant or quick. Poisoning in the ancient world was a brutal business, often involving hours of suffering before the end finally came. And with his death, this strange, obsessed, brilliant man passed from life into legend. His suicide became a cautionary tale, a story that moralists like Seneca used to illustrate the dangers of excessive attachment to luxury and pleasure. How could someone with 10 million sesterces believe themselves poor? What kind of madness leads a person to choose death over modest prosperity? Surely this was the ultimate indictment of aristocratic excess, proof that great wealth could corrupt the soul and distort one's perception of reality so completely that the normal human instinct for survival could be overcome. But perhaps there's something else in this story as well, something beyond simple moral condemnation. Apicius had built his entire identity around food, around a certain lifestyle of culinary excellence. He had become, in a sense, a living symbol. Apicius, the name representing an ideal of gastronomic sophistication. To continue living as a diminished version of himself, to watch his reputation fade as he made compromises and economies, perhaps felt to him like a kind of death anyway, a slow erasure of everything he had built. The poison offered a quicker end, and one that would preserve his legend intact. He would be remembered as Apicius the Magnificent, not Apicius the impoverished, struggling to maintain appearances on his dwindling fortune. It's a deeply Roman story in some ways. The Romans admired grandeur, even when it tipped into excess. They respected those who committed fully to their chosen path, even when that commitment seemed irrational. And they had a complicated relationship with suicide, sometimes viewing it as cowardly, other times as noble, depending on the circumstances and the person involved. Apicius's legacy endured. His name remained attached to elaborate cooking, to expensive ingredients, to the pursuit of culinary excellence regardless of cost. For centuries, cookbooks and food writers would reference him. To call a dish Apician was to signal that it was luxurious, sophisticated, perhaps a bit extravagant. The cookbook attributed to him was copied and recopied through the Middle Ages, eventually making its way into print with the invention of the printing press. Renaissance and early modern European cuisine was influenced by the recipes and techniques preserved in those pages. Even today, food historians and experimental archaeologists study de recoquinaria, attempting to recreate Roman dishes, to understand ancient flavor profiles, to connect the food of the past with our modern understanding of cooking. And when they write about Roman cuisine, they inevitably write about Apicius, the man whose obsession with food was so complete that it defined his life and ultimately determined his death. But what exactly was Apicius cooking? What were these dishes that consumed his fortune and captured his imagination? Some of them you might find surprisingly palatable, flavors and combinations that would feel familiar to a modern eater. Others are genuinely strange, ingredients and preparations that seem alien, even disturbing. To understand Roman cuisine, to really grasp what made it distinctive, we need to descend from the rarefied world of Apicius's banquets and examine the actual substances involved. Let us turn our attention now to the ingredients themselves, to the tastes and textures that defined Roman food. We'll explore mysteries solved by archaeology, delicacies that seem bizarre to modern sensibilities, and the peculiar Roman palate that found perfection in the fermented essence of fish guts. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a condiment. Perhaps you picture ketchup or mustard or soy sauce or hot sauce. These are the flavor enhancers of our modern world, substances we add to food to improve or alter taste. Now imagine that one of these condiments was so valuable that a single pint could cost more than a month's wages for a skilled worker. Imagine that it was produced in vast factories, shipped across an entire empire, and appeared on virtually every table from the emperor's palace to the humblest tavern. Imagine that its production involved leaving fish entrails to rot in the Mediterranean sun for months, and that the resulting liquid was considered not merely acceptable, but absolutely essential to civilized dining. Welcome to the world of garum, ancient Rome's most important and most peculiar culinary ingredient. To understand Roman cuisine, you must first understand garum. It appeared in nearly every recipe. It was the foundation of sauces, the background note in countless dishes, the secret ingredient that gave Roman food its distinctive character. And for centuries after Rome's fall, the recipe was lost, leaving historians to puzzle over ancient descriptions and wonder what this mysterious substance actually tasted like. Let us begin with what garum was in the most basic sense. It was a fermented fish sauce produced through a process that sounds, initially, quite unappetizing. The Romans would take small fish, anchovies were common, but various species might be used, and gut them, reserving the intestines and other entrails. These fish parts would be placed in large ceramic vessels, massive amphorae or specially designed vats, and mixed with substantial quantities of salt. The ratio was crucial. Too little salt, and the mixture would simply putrefy into an unusable toxic mess. The right amount of salt would preserve the fish while allowing controlled fermentation to occur. These vessels would then be left in the sun for weeks, for months. The heat and the salt would work together, breaking down the fish tissues, liquefying them slowly. Enzymes from the fish's own digestive system would begin to decompose the proteins, transforming them into amino acids. Beneficial bacteria, tolerant of the high salt content, would colonize the mixture, contributing to the fermentation process. Gradually, over the course of 2 to 3 months typically, the solid fish parts would dissolve into a rich, dark liquid. The smell during this process must have been extraordinary. The production facilities, and archaeology has revealed several of them, were typically located on the outskirts of cities or in coastal areas where prevailing winds would carry the odor out to sea rather than into residential neighborhoods. The citizens of Rome tolerated garum production the way modern communities tolerate sewage treatment plants or industrial facilities. They wanted the product, but preferred not to live adjacent to its creation. When the fermentation was complete, the liquid would be strained off. What remained was garum, a thin, brown, intensely savory sauce. The solids left behind weren't wasted. They could be further processed into a cheaper, coarser product called alec, which was sold to those who couldn't afford premium garum. But garum itself came in grades, in levels of quality that determined its price. The finest garum, called garum sociorum, or garum of the Allies, came from specific production facilities in Spain, particularly around the area of New Carthage. This premium product could indeed cost thousands of sesterces per amphora. It was made from the best fish, processed with the greatest care, aged for optimal time, and filtered to perfect clarity. This was the garum that appeared on aristocratic tables, the garum that Apicius would have used in his most refined sauces. Lower grades existed for more modest consumers. A basic garum, perfectly adequate for everyday cooking, might cost a few sesterces per pint, affordable even for relatively poor Romans. This democratization of garum is part of what made it so central to Roman cuisine. It wasn't purely a luxury good like saffron or imported spices. Everyone could afford some version of it, and everyone used it. But what did it taste like? For generations, this question haunted food historians. Ancient sources praised garum's ability to enhance flavor, its savory richness, but gave few details that would allow modern cooks to understand it. Some historians speculated it must have been mild, since the Romans used so much of it. Others imagined it as overwhelmingly pungent, an acquired taste that ancient palates had adapted to through constant exposure. The mystery began to clear in recent decades, thanks to experimental archaeology and a realization: garum wasn't unique. Asian cuisines had been making fermented fish sauces for centuries, using essentially the same technique. Vietnamese nuoc mam, Thai nam pla, Filipino patis, these were all products of the same basic process: fish and salt left to ferment until they became liquid umami. When food historians began comparing Roman descriptions of garum with these Asian fish sauces, the similarities were striking. And when experimental archaeologists attempted to recreate garum using ancient methods, the results were recognizable to anyone familiar with Southeast Asian cuisine. Garum, it turns out, tasted something like a more intense version of these fish sauces, with a pronounced anchovy character. It was salty, certainly, but not overwhelmingly so. It was rich in what we now call umami, that savory, meaty, deeply satisfying taste that comes from glutamates and other amino acids. It added depth and complexity to dishes, enhancing other flavors rather than dominating them. A small amount could transform a bland stew into something satisfying, could add savoriness to vegetables, could complement meats and fish without overpowering their natural taste. The Romans were, in essence, using garum the way modern cooks use stock, soy sauce, or Worcestershire sauce, as a flavor foundation, a source of that satisfying savory quality that makes food taste complete. And once you understand this, Roman cuisine suddenly makes more sense. The recipes in Apicius's cookbook that call for garum in what seem like bizarre combinations, garum with fruit, garum with honey, garum with wine, become comprehensible. They're balancing flavors, playing sweet against salty, using garum's umami to round out and deepen other tastes. Archaeological evidence confirms garum's ubiquity. Shipwrecks in the Mediterranean have revealed amphorae full of garum, preserved by the sea for 2,000 years. Chemical analysis of these ancient samples shows the same amino acid profiles as modern fish sauces. Shops in Pompeii, frozen in time by Vesuvius's eruption, included establishments dedicated solely to selling garum, with price lists painted on the walls indicating various grades and costs. The sewers beneath Roman cities, when archaeologically examined, show residues consistent with heavy garum consumption. The population was eating this source in substantial quantities. But garum, for all its importance, was just one element of Roman cuisine, and not the most exotic by far. The Romans had access to the resources of an empire that stretched from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria. Exotic ingredients flowed into Rome, and wealthy Romans competed to serve the most unusual, the most expensive, the most impressive dishes at their banquets. This led to a culinary arms race of sorts, a constant quest for novelty and extravagance that produced some genuinely bizarre food items. Consider the flamingo. These elegant pink birds, standing tall in shallow waters, were not common in Italy, but they could be found in parts of North Africa and the Near East. And the Romans, or at least the wealthiest Romans, decided that flamingo tongues were a delicacy worthy of the finest tables. Why specifically tongues? This wasn't arbitrary. The Romans had a fascination with textural variety in food, and different parts of animals offered different textures. A flamingo's tongue is a muscular organ, firm but not tough, with a unique consistency. It also represented extreme luxury. Each bird provided only one tongue, and a dish might require dozens of them. Serving flamingo tongues was a way of saying, "I am so wealthy that I can afford to import exotic birds and use only the tiniest portion of each one for your entertainment." The actual process of obtaining flamingo tongues was labor-intensive, and one must acknowledge, rather grim. Birds would be captured or killed, and slaves would extract the tongues, discarding the rest of the carcass. These tongues would be preserved, perhaps in garum or through salting for the journey to Rome. Once there, they would be prepared according to various recipes, boiled, stewed, or incorporated into complex dishes designed to showcase their texture while adding complementary flavors. Did they taste remarkable? Probably not, truthfully. Like most animal tongues, flamingo tongues likely had a fairly neutral flavor, taking on the taste of whatever sauce they were cooked in. But that wasn't the point. The point was the expense, the rarity, the sheer extravagance of serving something so difficult to obtain. When a Roman host served flamingo tongues to his guests, he was serving status, power, and wealth as much as food. But flamingo tongues, exotic as they were, at least involved a recognizable animal, prepared in a comprehensible way. Other Roman delicacies push further into territory that modern sensibilities find genuinely strange. Take, for instance, the dormouse. Dormice are small rodents, somewhat larger than field mice, but smaller than squirrels, native to Europe and Asia. They hibernate in winter, storing fat to survive the cold months, and emerge in spring considerably plumper than when they entered their burrows. The Romans looked at these creatures and saw not vermin, but potential cuisine. Specifically, they developed techniques for raising and fattening dormice for the table, transforming them into a luxury food item. Archaeological evidence for this practice is remarkably clear. Excavations at various Roman sites have uncovered special pottery vessels called dolia, specifically designed for keeping dormice. These were large jars with small air holes and sometimes with interior ramps or ledges. Dormice would be placed inside these containers and fed a rich diet of acorns, chestnuts, and walnuts. The confined space prevented exercise, and the high-calorie diet caused the animals to gain substantial weight. When they reached what the Romans considered optimal plumpness, they would be killed and prepared for cooking. The recipe that survives in Apicius's cookbook calls for stuffing dormice with minced pork, the meat of other dormice, and pine nuts, all bound together with garum, of course. The stuffed dormice would then be roasted or baked until the skin was crispy and the filling cooked through. They were apparently served whole, and guests would eat them with their hands, working around the small bones. Modern attempts to recreate this dish, using legally and ethically sourced small game rather than actual dormice, which are protected in many areas, suggest that the result was probably similar to eating small game birds like quail. The meat would be rich and fatty from the specialized diet, and the stuffing would add complexity and additional richness. It was, by all accounts, genuinely tasty, though the thought of eating rodents causes visceral reactions in many modern people who have been culturally conditioned to view such creatures as pests rather than food. Yet another category of Roman delicacies focused on parts of common animals that we typically discard or ignore. The Romans wasted very little of the animals they slaughtered, but they went beyond simple thrift into active appreciation of organs and parts that most modern cuisines overlook. So's womb and udders, for instance, appear in multiple recipes. These were prized not for any particular flavor, which was probably fairly mild, but for their texture. After proper preparation, they became tender and almost gelatinous, with a quality the Romans found appealing. They would be served in elaborate sauces, often sweet and savory preparations involving honey, wine, and herbs, along with the ever-present garum. The emphasis on texture extended to other unusual preparations. Sea urchins, harvested from coastal waters, were consumed both fresh and preserved. The Romans appreciated the rich, creamy texture of sea urchin roe, much as Japanese cuisine does today. Oysters were massively popular, to the point that Rome developed sophisticated systems for transporting live oysters from coastal areas to the capital, keeping them in sea-water-filled tanks to maintain freshness. The wealthy would serve dozens of oysters at a single meal, each one carefully opened and presented. Birds of various kinds found their way to Roman tables, and the more exotic the better for status-conscious hosts. Peacocks were particularly valued, not so much for their taste, which was apparently fairly ordinary, but for their spectacular appearance. A roasted peacock might be served with its colorful tail feathers reattached, creating a visual spectacle that dominated the dining table. Guests would admire the presentation before the bird was carved and eaten. Parrots, too, appear in some sources as banquet fare, again more for their novelty than for any exceptional flavor. But perhaps the most intriguing ingredient in Roman cuisine was one that we can't taste today, because it no longer exists. The Romans had access to a seasoning called silphium, which they valued so highly that it may have been harvested to extinction. Silphium was a plant that grew in the region of Cyrenaica, in what is now Libya. It was related to fennel, or perhaps to the now extinct asafoetida plants of the ancient world. The Romans used both the leaves and the sap of this plant, and by all accounts, it was extraordinary. Ancient sources describe it as having a powerful, complex flavor, perhaps garlic-like or onion-like, but with additional depth and character. It was used both as a flavoring in cooking and as a digestive aid, believed to help the stomach process the rich, heavy foods typical of Roman banquets. The problem was that silphium was apparently difficult or impossible to cultivate. It grew wild in a specific region, and attempts to transplant it elsewhere failed. As demand increased, driven by Rome's appetite for the plant, harvesting intensified. The plant became rarer, and prices rose accordingly. By the 1st century CE, silphium was already becoming scarce. The Emperor Nero reportedly received a single stalk of silphium as a precious gift, indicating how rare it had become. Within a few generations, it disappeared entirely, probably driven to extinction by over-harvesting. What did it taste like? We'll never know for certain, though food historians have speculated based on ancient descriptions. Some believe it was similar to asafoetida, a pungent spice still used in some Indian cuisines. Others suggest it might have been closer to garlic or shallots in flavor profile. The mystery remains, and the loss of silphium stands as a reminder that the Romans' appetite for exotic foods could have lasting consequences, depleting resources and driving species to extinction. The Romans' taste preferences, their actual palate, differed in significant ways from modern Western tastes. They loved combinations that we might find odd or even off-putting. Sweet and savory together appeared constantly. Honey with meat, fruit with fish, wine reduced to syrup and used as a sauce. They appreciated strong, assertive flavors, layering garum with wine, vinegar, herbs and spices in ways that produced complex, intense taste experiences. They also had a fondness for what might be called transformation in food. They liked dishes where the original ingredient was altered so completely that it became something else. Fish might be pounded into a paste, combined with other ingredients, reshaped and cooked, emerging as something that bore little resemblance to its original form. Meats might be minced, spiced, stuffed into casings or other meats, and prepared in ways that created entirely new textures and flavors. This approach to cooking, this willingness to experiment and combine and transform, produced a cuisine that was genuinely sophisticated, whatever modern eaters might think of specific ingredients or combinations. The Romans were pushing boundaries, exploring possibilities, developing techniques that would influence European cooking for centuries to come. Archaeological research continues to reveal new details about Roman food. Analysis of ancient sewers and cesspits, while unglamorous, provides hard data about what people actually ate rather than what was idealized in literary sources. Isotope analysis of bones from Roman cemeteries reveals information about diet across different social classes. Chemical analysis of residues in cooking vessels and amphorae shows what substances were actually used in kitchens. And experimental archaeology, where modern researchers attempt to recreate Roman recipes using period-appropriate techniques, helps bridge the gap between ancient descriptions and actual taste experience. What emerges from all this research is a picture of Roman cuisine as diverse, creative, and often quite good, even when it included ingredients that seem bizarre to us. The Romans were serious about food in a way that few ancient cultures matched. They wrote about it, theorized about it, competed over it, and in cases like Apicius, sacrificed enormous resources to it. But all of this, the dormice and the flamingo tongues, the garum and the silphium, the elaborate sauces and the transformed ingredients, existed within a specific social context. Food in Rome wasn't just sustenance or even pleasure. It was a language of power, a way of performing status, a tool for building and maintaining social networks. To understand Roman food fully, we need to see it in action, served and consumed in the setting where it mattered most. We need to attend a Roman dinner party. We need to recline on a triclinium couch, experience the elaborate ritual of a proper cena, and see how food functioned as social theater in the world of Rome's elite. And we need to hold in our minds, as we do so, the contrast between the guests reclining in comfort and the slaves laboring below to make it all possible. Picture yourself now, if you will, as a guest arriving at a Roman villa on an evening when the master has decided to host a cena, a formal dinner party. You have been invited, which means you possess some combination of social status, political influence, or family connection that makes you worth cultivating. The invitation itself was delivered days ago by a slave, a small wax tablet bearing the host's seal and indicating the date and approximate time you should arrive. You have dressed carefully for the occasion, wearing your finest toga if you are male, your most elegant stola if you are female, knowing that appearances matter in this world where status is constantly being negotiated and displayed. The villa stands before you as evening settles over Rome, the last golden light of day painting the walls in warm amber tones. You pass through the entrance, the ostium, where a slave greets you and takes your outdoor shoes, providing you with lighter indoor sandals. Already this small ritual signals the transition from the public world of the streets to the private realm of the household. A nomenclator, a slave whose specific duty is to know the names and connections of all the guests, approaches, and quietly confirms your identity before leading you toward the interior of the house. You move through the atrium, the central courtyard with its impluvium, the shallow pool collecting rainwater from the opening in the roof above. The house is already filling with lamplight, dozens of oil lamps positioned throughout the rooms, casting a warm, flickering glow. The smell of food drifts from somewhere deeper in the house, complex aromas of roasting meat, baking bread, herbs and spices mingling with the sharp, familiar note of garum and the sweeter scent of honeyed wine. Other guests are arriving as well, and you exchange greetings. the careful formal acknowledgements that Romans use in these settings. Everyone is assessing everyone else, noting who has been invited, what the guest list reveals about the host's current social and political networks, who is positioned higher or lower in the complex hierarchy of Roman society. These observations are made subtly, behind practiced smiles and polite conversation, but they are being made nonetheless. Eventually, the nomenclator indicates that it is time to move to the triclinium, the dining room. And here is where the evening's careful choreography truly begins, because the triclinium is not simply a room where people eat. It is a stage, and the arrangement of guests upon it communicates volumes about relationships, status, and the host's intentions. The triclinium takes its name from its defining feature: 3 large couches arranged in a U-shape around a central open area. Each couch, called a lectus, is broad enough to accommodate 3 people reclining side by side, meaning that a full triclinium can host 9 guests. The couches are not separate pieces of furniture, but rather built-in structures, cushioned and covered with fine fabrics, designed specifically for the reclining posture that Romans consider the proper way for civilized people to dine. You will not be sitting this evening. Sitting is for the poor, for barbarians, for those who cannot afford proper furniture or who lack the sophistication to recline properly. No, you will be lying on your left side, propped up on your left elbow, leaving your right hand free to reach for food and drink. This position takes practice to maintain comfortably for hours, and it is both a mark of Roman culture and a genuine physical challenge for those unaccustomed to it. But where exactly you recline matters enormously. The triclinium has a complex geography of status. The place of highest honor, called the locus consularis, is on the middle couch, in the center position. This is typically reserved for the most distinguished guest, someone whose presence particularly honors the host. The positions adjacent to this spot are also prestigious, their importance radiating outward from that central point of maximum status. The host himself typically reclines on the lowest ranked couch, in a position where he can easily observe all the guests and signal to the serving slaves. This placement is one of calculated humility, the host placing himself technically below his guests while actually maintaining complete control over the evening's proceedings. As the nomenclator guides you to your designated position, you understand immediately what the host is communicating. A good placement near the center, near the locus consularis, indicates respect and favor. A position further from the center suggests that while your presence is welcome, you are not among the evening's most important guests. Romans are exquisitely attuned to these signals, and entire relationships can shift based on where one is positioned at a dinner party. You settle onto your couch, arranging yourself into the reclining position, adjusting cushions, and finding the angle that will be most comfortable for the long evening ahead. To your left and right, other guests are doing the same, and the conversation begins to flow more freely now that everyone is positioned. The social hierarchy has been established through placement, and people can relax into their assigned roles. A slave appears at your side, moving with the practiced silence that good household slaves cultivate. He carries a basin and a pitcher of water, and you extend your hands to be washed. This ritual cleansing marks the formal beginning of the meal. All around the triclinium, other slaves are performing the same service, and the host signals with a slight nod that the scena may begin. The first course arrives, what the Romans call the gustatio. The appetizers meant to stimulate the appetite and establish the tone for the meal to come. Small dishes are placed on low tables positioned within easy reach of the couches. You see eggs prepared in various ways, perhaps hard-boiled and served with a pungent garum-based sauce, or perhaps mixed with other ingredients into a kind of custard. There are olives, of course, both green and black, glistening with oil. Vegetables preserved in brine or vinegar, providing sharp, acidic notes that will awaken the palate. Small pieces of fish, perhaps raw oysters on their half-shells, or sardines that have been grilled and dressed with herbs. You reach for food with your right hand, the only hand used for eating, since your left is occupied with maintaining your reclining position. There are no forks on a Roman table. You will eat with your fingers and, when appropriate, with a spoon. The Romans have developed a kind of etiquette around this, a way of eating with the hands that remains graceful and refined. You take small bites, you do not overload your fingers, you use the provided napkins, brought from home actually, since guests are expected to supply their own, to clean your hands between bites. Wine appears, but not as you might expect. The Romans rarely drink wine undiluted, considering the practice barbaric. Instead, slaves mix the wine with water in a large vessel called a crater, and the ratio of wine to water is carefully calibrated to the host's preference and the evening's intended tone. A highly diluted wine suggests a more serious, conversation-focused dinner. A stronger mixture indicates a more celebratory, potentially more raucous evening. The wine is served in cups, and slaves move constantly around the triclinium, refilling cups before they can empty, ensuring that no guest ever has to ask for more. Between courses, entertainment begins. The Romans do not simply eat and talk, they create a complete sensory experience. Musicians enter, perhaps playing a water organ, that strange Roman instrument that produces sound through a combination of water pressure and wind. The music is pleasant but not intrusive, providing a background wash of melody that fills the spaces in conversation. Or perhaps the entertainment is more dramatic. Dancers performing complex routines, their movements stylized and precise, or acrobats demonstrating feats of balance and strength in the open space at the center of the triclinium. The host may call for poetry readings, either performed by slaves trained in elocution or by guests who have prepared something appropriate. A poet might recite verses praising the host's virtues or perform something more classical, drawing from the works of Virgil or Horace or Ovid. The other guests listen with apparent attention, offering appreciation at appropriate moments, though in truth, many are more focused on the social dynamics playing out around them. And then comes the prima mensa, the main courses, and here is where a wealthy host truly demonstrates his resources and creativity. Slaves emerge from the kitchen carrying platters that are works of art in themselves. A whole roasted boar might appear, its skin crispy and glazed, perhaps with its mouth propped open to reveal smaller birds that have been cooked inside it. As the boar is carved, these birds might be released, fluttering around the triclinium in a moment of theatrical surprise that delights some guests and startles others. Or perhaps the centerpiece is a pig that has been prepared in sections, with each section cooked differently and seasoned with different sauces, so that a single animal provides multiple taste experiences. The Romans love these transformation dishes, presentations where food is disguised or altered, where what appears to be one thing turns out to be another. A fish might be fashioned into the shape of a bird. A vegetable dish might be colored and flavored to resemble meat. These culinary illusions are part of the entertainment, demonstrating the skill of the host's cooks and the sophistication of his household. Each dish comes with its accompanying sauce, and here, the Roman love of complex flavors is fully displayed. A simple roasted meat might be elevated by a sauce involving garum, honey, wine, vinegar, pepper, and herbs. The components balance to create something far more interesting than any single ingredient would provide. The Romans layer flavors with remarkable sophistication, building taste experiences that evolve as you eat, where the initial sweetness gives way to savory notes, where the richness of meat is cut by acid or brightened by herbs. Course follows course. Fish dishes arrive, perhaps the prawns that Apicius deemed superior to those of Libya, prepared in ways that showcase their delicate flavor. Vegetables appear, but prepared elaborately, never simply boiled or steamed. They might be pureed, mixed with eggs and cheese, baked into tarts, or stewed with meat and spices until they become something entirely different from their raw state. Throughout all of this, conversation flows, though it is not entirely casual. A Roman dinner party is a place where business is conducted, where political alliances are formed and tested, where information is exchanged and favors are negotiated. The host is carefully managing these interactions, sometimes steering conversation toward particular topics, sometimes allowing it to range freely. A skilled host knows how to create an atmosphere where deals can be made without the vulgarity of explicit negotiation, where agreements can be reached through subtle implication and shared understanding. The nomenclator, that slave whose duty is to know everyone's names and connections, stands near the host, periodically leaning close to whisper information. The man in the third position has just secured a lucrative contract supplying grain to the army. The woman on the middle couch is the sister of the new provincial governor. This intelligence allows the host to guide conversations strategically, to make connections between guests who might benefit from knowing each other, to position himself as a valuable node in Rome's complex social network. As the evening progresses and the wine continues to flow, the atmosphere becomes gradually more relaxed, more convivial. Voices rise slightly, laughter becomes more frequent. Some guests are showing signs of the meal's abundance, faces flushed from wine and rich food. And here we must address one of the persistent myths about Roman dining, the question of the vomitorium. The word vomitorium does appear in Roman architectural terminology, but it has nothing to do with what happens at dinner parties. A vomitorium is simply an exit passageway in an amphitheater or theater, a corridor through which crowds can spew forth after an event. The connection to regurgitation is purely linguistic, based on the Latin word vomere, to spew or discharge. Did Romans sometimes vomit during dinner parties? Yes, certainly. Heavy drinking and extremely rich food would occasionally lead to this result, and some sources mention guests relieving their stomachs in order to continue eating. But this was not institutionalized, not an expected part of the dining experience. There were no special rooms designated for purging. The practice, when it occurred, was more a consequence of excess than a planned element of the meal. Some guests might discreetly excuse themselves if they felt unwell, attended by slaves who would help them outside or to an appropriate location. But the popular image of Romans routinely gorging themselves, vomiting and returning to gorge some more is largely exaggerated, based on satirical writings and moral critiques that were describing worst-case scenarios, not typical behavior. The meal continues with the secunda mensa, the dessert course, though this term is somewhat misleading by modern standards. These are not sugary confections like contemporary desserts. Instead, you might be served fresh fruits, perhaps figs or dates or grapes, carefully arranged on platters. There might be nuts, pastries sweetened with honey, or elaborate preparations involving dried fruits stewed with spices. The Romans have limited access to sugar as we know it. Their sweetness comes from honey, from fruit syrups, from reduced wine. The desserts are pleasant, refreshing after the heavy richness of the main courses. But they are not the climax of the meal in the way dessert often is in modern dining. As the secunda mensa concludes, slaves begin preparing the apophoreta, the party favors that guests will take home. These might be small packages of delicacies, samples of particularly fine garum or other luxury food items, or they might be more substantial gifts, small pieces of silver, quality fabrics, valuable oils or perfumes. The generosity and appropriateness of these gifts are yet another way the host communicates status and builds relationships. A particularly valuable gift to a particular guest sends a clear signal about that guest's importance to the host. The evening is winding down now, though several hours have passed since you first reclined on the couch. Your left arm is somewhat numb from maintaining the reclining position, and you shift slightly to restore circulation. Around the triclinium, other guests are also showing signs of the lengthy meal, and the conversation has become more languid, more philosophical perhaps, or more personal. The host signals that the formal portion of the evening is concluding, and guests begin the process of departure. You rise from the couch, grateful to stretch muscles that have been held in position for so long. Slaves appear with your outdoor shoes, and you exchange final pleasantries with the host and other guests. The nomenclator is there again, ensuring that everyone is properly acknowledged, that no social niceties are overlooked. As you step out into the Roman night, the air cool and welcome after the warm, lamp-lit atmosphere of the triclinium, you carry with you your apophoreta and your impressions of the evening. You are already mentally composing how you will describe this dinner to others, what details you will emphasize, how you will position yourself in relation to the other guests and the host. Because a Roman dinner party is never just about the food, no matter how elaborate that food might be. It is about visibility, about status, about maintaining and building the complex web of relationships that determines one's place in Roman society. But let us pull back now. Let us see this scene from a different angle. While you and the other 8 guests reclined in comfort, consuming elaborate dishes and engaging in witty conversation, how many slaves were required to make this possible? The number is staggering. In the kitchen below, at least a dozen slaves were cooking, preparing, and assembling dishes. Multiple slaves attended to the fires, ensuring they burned at the right temperature. Others prepared ingredients, the endless chopping, grinding, and mixing that complex Roman dishes require. Still others focused on presentation, arranging food on platters in aesthetically pleasing ways, ensuring that each dish that emerged from the kitchen was visually impressive. In the triclinium itself, at least 6 to 8 serving slaves moved constantly, bringing dishes, refilling wine cups, attending to guests' needs, clearing away empty plates, maintaining the smooth flow of the meal. The nomenclator stood ready with information. Musicians and entertainers, often slaves themselves, performed between courses. Additional slaves waited in the background, ready to assist with any unexpected need. Outside, slaves maintained the lighting, trimming lamp wicks, adding oil, ensuring that the villa remained properly illuminated throughout the evening. Other slaves guarded the entrance, monitoring arrivals and departures. Kitchen slaves not directly involved in cooking washed dishes, cleaned surfaces, prepared for the next day's meals. In total, a dinner party for 9 guests might require 30 or more slaves working throughout the evening and into the night. And these slaves would not eat the food they served. They would receive their meals later, after the guests had departed, after the clearing and cleaning was done. Simple fare, perhaps porridge and bread, leftover vegetables, the scraps that even a wealthy household would not waste but would never serve to guests. The contrast is almost unbearable to contemplate. 9 people consuming what might represent several years' wages for an ordinary Roman, attended by dozens of people who would never taste such luxury, who would return to their sparse quarters after the evening's work and sleep a few hours before beginning again. This is the reality underlying every elaborate Roman feast, every culinary triumph, every demonstration of wealth and status through food. The meal you have just experienced, the one we have walked through together, would cost more than a laborer might earn in a full year of work. A single course, perhaps that roasted boar stuffed with birds, might represent weeks or months of wages. The garum alone, if it was premium garum sociorum, could cost as much as a skilled craftsman would make in a season. And this is just one dinner party, one evening in a wealthy household that might host such events regularly, multiple times per month, each one requiring similar expense and labor. This is what food meant in Rome. It was a language of power, spoken through exotic ingredients and elaborate preparation. It was a tool of social control, a way of obligating guests through hospitality, of demonstrating superiority through excess. It was entertainment, theater, spectacle, And it was made possible by a vast infrastructure of slavery, by thousands upon thousands of people whose labor was owned, whose skills were exploited, who made possible the legendary cuisine of ancient Rome, while rarely benefiting from it themselves. The kitchen slave we met at the beginning of this journey, waking in darkness to begin another day of brutal labor, he is the foundation upon which all of this is built. Apicius's experiments, his fig-fed pigs and his voyage for prawns required slaves to implement. The elaborate dishes served at aristocratic dinners required slaves to prepare. The garum that flavored everything was made by slaves in coastal factories, breathing fumes and working in heat. The dormice were fattened by slaves, the flamingo tongues extracted by slaves, the complex sauces stirred for hours by slaves whose arms ached and whose eyes watered from smoke. Roman cuisine, for all its sophistication and creativity, for all its genuine achievements in flavor and technique, was built on suffering. This is not to condemn the food itself, nor even to condemn the Romans beyond the moral judgment we would apply to any slave-owning society. It is simply to see the full picture, to understand that every culinary triumph had a human cost, that every meal we have discussed tonight involved someone's labor, often someone's pain. And yet that food was extraordinary. Despite its foundation in exploitation, despite the moral complications that surround it, Roman cuisine represented real innovation, real creativity, real skill. The techniques developed in Roman kitchens influenced European cooking for centuries. The flavor combinations they pioneered, the sauces they created, the understanding of how different tastes interact, all of this represented genuine culinary achievement. So we are left with a paradox, one that history presents to us repeatedly. Human beings are capable of creating remarkable things, even when the systems that make those creations possible are deeply unjust. Beauty and suffering coexist. Genius and exploitation intertwine. The Roman banquet, with its elaborate dishes and refined flavors, and the Roman kitchen, with its smoke and heat and bonded labor, are two parts of the same story, inseparable, each giving meaning to the other. As you settle more deeply into rest this evening, as your mind drifts and consciousness softens, perhaps hold this thought. History is complicated. The past is not simply good or bad, admirable or condemnable. It is human in all that word's complexity. The Romans created extraordinary cuisine, and they did so through a system we would find abhorrent. Both things are true. Both things matter. And from this distance, 2,000 years removed, we can appreciate what they achieved while acknowledging what it cost. We can marvel at their culinary innovation while remembering the slaves who made it possible. We can learn from their techniques and their creativity while rejecting the social structures that underlay them. The ancient Roman kitchen is closed now, its fires long cold. The slaves who labored there are dust, their names forgotten, their skills and suffering known only through fragmentary evidence. The aristocrats who reclined at banquets, who tasted flamingo tongues and praised garum sociorum, they too are gone. Their wealth and status meaning nothing now. Even Apicius, who loved food so much that he chose death over moderation, is only a name, a collection of recipes, a cautionary tale about obsession. But the food remains, recorded in texts, preserved in recipes, analyzed by archaeologists, recreated by experimental cooks. Through it, we can touch the past, can taste something of what Rome was, can understand a civilization through what it chose to eat and how it chose to prepare it. And in understanding their food, we understand something essential about the Romans themselves. Their values, their excesses, their creativity and their cruelty, all served together on a bronze platter, flavored with fermented fish, sweetened with honey, complicated beyond easy judgment. Sleep well, knowing that the world has moved on from those days, that the smoke-filled kitchens are empty, that the elaborate hierarchies of the Roman triclinium have faded into history. Sleep well in the comfort of the present, where food is simpler, where the labor that produces it is at least nominally free, where the elaborate social theater of the Roman dinner party has given way to more egalitarian forms of hospitality. Sleep well, and let the ancient world recede into the gentle darkness of dreams, interesting but distant, a story to consider but not a place to remain. Imagine yourself waking before dawn in a small stone chamber, narrow and cold. The walls around you are thick, built to last, but they cannot keep out the chill that seeps up from the earthen floor. You share this space with perhaps 3 or 4 others, their breathing the only sound in the darkness. Some cough, a dry, persistent sound that has become as familiar as your own heartbeat. You know each person by the particular rhythm of their breath, the specific way they shift in the night. This is a leper hospital, what medieval people called a lazar house, and it has been your home since the day you were separated from everything you once knew. The year is somewhere in the 13th century, though the exact date matters little now. Time has taken on a different quality within these walls. It stretches and compresses in strange ways, marked not by seasons of planting and harvest, but by the slow progression of your disease and the unchanging routine of religious observance. The bell rings for morning prayers, not the bell you must carry, we'll come to that shortly, but the chapel bell, calling you to the first of many daily services. You rise slowly, carefully. Movement requires thought now. Your hands, once quick and sure, have lost sensation in the fingers. You've learned to watch them as you work, to compensate with your eyes for what your nerves no longer tell you. It's a small adaptation among many. You dress in the simple robe provided by the hospital. It's made of rough wool, practical and durable, dyed the dull brown or grey that marks you as a leper. Some hospitals require their residents to wear a specific cloak or hood, a visual announcement of your condition that serves as warning to any who might come near. The fabric chafes against skin that has become sensitive in some places and entirely numb in others, a cruel paradox of the disease. Before you leave your chamber, you collect your warning implements. In many regions, the law requires you to carry a clapper, 2 pieces of wood on a hinge that you must sound as you move through any public space. In other places, it's a bell, small and insistent, hung on a cord around your neck. The sound precedes you everywhere, announcing your presence, giving healthy people time to step away, to cover their faces, to shield their children. You are a walking proclamation of danger, a living reminder of human fragility. The hospital itself is typically located outside the town walls, close enough that its residents can beg from passers-by on the main road, but far enough that the townspeople can maintain the comfortable fiction that leprosy exists somewhere else, beyond their daily lives. The complex usually consists of a chapel, a dormitory or several small chambers, a refectory for meals, and perhaps a small infirmary for those in the final stages of the disease. There might be a modest garden where herbs are grown, both for flavoring the simple food and for the endless, mostly futile attempts at treatment. The architecture is functional, built by donation or civic duty, and it reflects the medieval understanding of charity. You are cared for, yes, but you are also contained. The walls that shelter you also separate you from the world of the healthy. There are rules posted, often in Latin, that few residents can read, but which are explained clearly enough. You must not enter the town without permission. You must not touch healthy people. You must not use the common wells. You must not enter taverns or markets. Your world has been reduced to these few buildings and the narrow paths between them. You make your way to the chapel, moving through the dim corridors where the smell of damp stone mixes with the herbal smoke from the infirmary. Attempts to purify the air, to ward off the evil humors that medieval medicine believed caused disease. The chapel is the heart of the leper hospital, and you will visit it 7 times today, following the canonical hours that structure monastic life. Prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, compline, the Latin names for divisions of the day that now divide your life. The morning prayers are long but familiar. You stand or kneel according to your ability. Some residents can no longer kneel, their joints stiffened by the disease's progression. The priest, sometimes a dedicated chaplain, sometimes a local cleric fulfilling an obligation, leads you through psalms and prayers. There is a particular emphasis on suffering, on the purification that comes through earthly tribulation, on the promise of heavenly reward for those who bear their crosses with patience. You've heard these words so many times that they've become a kind of background music to your thoughts. After prayers comes breakfast, a simple meal eaten in the refectory. Bread, perhaps some thin porridge, occasionally a bit of cheese. The quality and quantity depend entirely on the hospital's endowment and the generosity of local benefactors. Some leper houses are well-funded, established by wealthy merchants or nobles seeking to secure their salvation through charitable works. Others subsist on sporadic donations and what little the residents can contribute through begging. You eat carefully, mindfully. The loss of sensation in your hands means you must watch to ensure you don't burn yourself on hot food or miss your mouth entirely. You've developed techniques using your thumbs, which retain more feeling, to guide your fingers. Breaking bread into pieces you can manage, drinking from a cup held in both palms. Around you, others navigate their own accommodations with the disease. One man has lost several fingers entirely. A woman across the table turns her head at an odd angle because the disease has affected her facial nerves, leaving one eye unable to close completely. She wears a cloth wrapped around her forehead, protecting that vulnerable eye from dust and drying. The conversation during meals is quiet, practical. There is talk of small tasks, who will work in the garden today, which robes need mending, whether the hospice master will allow a trip to beg at the church gates on Sunday, when the congregation will be generous. There is news, too, filtered through the narrow opening between your world and the other. Someone heard that the harvest looks good this year, that there's been a marriage in town, that a new king has taken the throne in some distant country. These things feel remote, like stories from another life. After breakfast, you are assigned your tasks for the day. Despite the disease, despite the limitations of your body, you are expected to contribute to the household's functioning. This is partly practical. The leper hospital cannot afford to hire servants for every task, and partly theological. Labor is seen as virtuous, idleness as spiritually dangerous. So you work within your capabilities. If you retain enough dexterity, you might help with mending clothes or winding bandages from old linen. If your hands are too affected, you might assist in the garden, using your arms to carry baskets or your feet to tread down soil. Some residents tend to those who are bedridden, bringing them water, adjusting their covers, sitting with them during their final days. There's a hierarchy of ability here, and everyone understands where they fall on that spectrum, knowing that over time, they will likely move from helper to helped. The garden work is often preferred when weather permits. It gets you outside the stone walls, into the air and light. You can feel the sun on your face. Watch the seasons change in the slow unfurling of leaves and the gradual ripening of vegetables. The repetitive work, pulling weeds, watering, harvesting, has a meditative quality. Your mind can wander, and the physical exertion, while challenging, provides a sense of purpose. But today is Tuesday, a begging day. Several residents, including yourself, prepare to walk the short distance to the main road, where it passes closest to the hospital. You collect your clapper, ensuring it's working properly. You drape an additional cloth around your shoulders, one that clearly identifies you as a leper seeking alms. Some hospitals provide wooden bowls on long handles, allowing donors to drop coins or bread without coming close to the beggar's contaminated hands. The walk to the road is slow. Your feet have been affected by the disease, and walking is painful. The loss of sensation means you sometimes injure yourself without realizing, a stone cutting into your soul, a blister forming, and these wounds, unnoticed and untreated, can become dangerously infected. You've learned to check your feet each night, using your eyes to examine what your nerves can no longer feel. You take your position along the road, spacing yourself from the other beggars at an appropriate distance. This is a delicate matter, requiring both strategy and social navigation. Too close to the town gates and the authorities might drive you away. Too far, and you miss the heaviest foot traffic. You must also maintain distance from other beggars, both out of courtesy and to avoid appearing too numerous and therefore threatening. The clapper sounds as people approach, a rhythmic clack-clack that has become almost unconscious, like breathing. "Alms for the love of God," you call out, your voice following the formula you've learned. "Alms for a poor leper." The phrasing is important. You appeal not to personal pity, but to religious duty, reminding passers-by that charity is a path to salvation, that Christ himself touched lepers and commanded his followers to care for the afflicted. Most people hurry past, their faces averted. A few make the sign of the cross as they go, a gesture that might be blessing or protection against contamination. Perhaps both. Children stare until their parents pull them along, and you hear the warnings whispered, "Don't look too long, don't get too close, that's what happens to sinners." The association between leprosy and divine punishment is deeply embedded in medieval thought, though some theologians argue against it, pointing to biblical passages that complicate such simple moral equations. But some do stop. A well-dressed merchant's wife, conspicuously pious, approaches carefully and drops several coins into your bowl, her face expressing that particular mixture of fear and virtue. She mutters a prayer as she backs away. An elderly woman, perhaps someone who knew poverty herself, sets a small loaf of bread at a distance where you can reach it safely. A young man, drunk or brave, comes closer than most and makes a crude joke about disfigurement, then laughs nervously and hurries on when his friends don't join in. You collect what you can over several hours. The sun climbs higher and the road grows quiet during the midday heat. Eventually, the hospital master signals that it's time to return. You gather your meager takings, a handful of small coins, some bread, a half-eaten apple discarded by someone but still edible enough. Back at the hospital, you turn over the money to the common fund. The bread you're allowed to keep for your evening meal. The afternoon brings more prayers, sext and then none, and then a period of rest. Many residents sleep, exhausted by the morning's exertions and by the constant work of living in a body that no longer functions as it should. You lie on your pallet and close your eyes, but sleep doesn't always come easily. Your mind wanders to your former life. You remember your trade. Perhaps you were a carpenter, and you recall the satisfying resistance of wood grain under a sharp blade, the smell of fresh sawdust, the pride of crafting something useful and beautiful. Or maybe you were a farmer, and you think of the feeling of good soil crumbling in your hands, the weight of a full sack of grain, the sound of your children playing in the dooryard while you worked. These memories are vivid, but increasingly abstract, like stories someone told you about another person's life. The separation from your family is perhaps the cruelest aspect of the disease. When your condition was diagnosed, when the priest and the town physician examined the suspicious patches on your skin, tested your ability to feel a pinprick, looked for the characteristic nodules, your life changed in a single day. There was a ceremony in some places, a ritual separation called the separatio leprosorum. The priest read the burial service over you while you stood, alive, in the churchyard. You were legally dead, civilly if not physically, cut off from inheritance, from marriage, from all the bonds that connected you to society. Your family had been allowed, or perhaps required, to accompany you to the leper house on that first day. You remember your wife's face, trying to remain composed, trying to be strong, but her tears falling despite her efforts. Your children, confused and frightened, clinging to her skirts. The forced nature of the farewell, conducted in public, rushed, with no privacy for your grief. Your wife had pressed a small object into your hand, perhaps a religious token or something from your shared life, and then stepped back, creating the distance that would now define your relationship. Officially, your marriage was dissolved. Your property was divided as if you had died. Your children would be raised without you. But the reality, you've learned, is more complicated. Some families maintain contact, finding ways to support their leprous relatives from a distance. Your wife might leave food or coins at a designated spot near the hospital, a tree or a particular stone, where you can collect them safely. She might send messages through the hospital master. Once or twice a year, she might even come to the gates, standing at a careful distance, allowing you to see her and the children, though not to touch them, not to embrace them, not to fulfill any of the roles that defined your identity as husband and father. Other families disappear entirely, relieved perhaps to be free of the burden and the shame. You've seen men and women in the hospital who never receive visits, who never speak of their former lives, who seem to have closed off that part of themselves entirely. You can't decide which is harder, the painful maintenance of connection or the finality of abandonment. As evening approaches, there are more prayers. Vespers, the sunset office. The chapel fills with golden light that slants through the narrow windows, and for a moment, the space feels almost beautiful. The chanting takes on a mellower tone, and you feel the day winding down, the pattern repeating itself as it has for months or years, as it will continue until you can no longer rise for prayers, until you take your place among those who are bedridden in the infirmary, waiting for the end. Supper is similar to breakfast. Bread, perhaps some vegetable pottage if the garden has been productive. You eat in the same careful way, carrying out the same internal checklist of precautions. The conversation remains muted. Everyone is tired. The chronic nature of your condition creates a persistent fatigue that no amount of rest can fully address. After supper, there's a brief period of free time before the final prayers of Compline. Some residents sit in the common room, if the hospital has one, talking quietly or simply existing in each other's presence. There's a strange comfort in being among others who share your condition. You don't have to hide your deformities, don't have to manage the complex emotional labor of making healthy people comfortable with your appearance. Here, you are simply yourself, among others who understand implicitly what your life has become. One of the residents produces a small wooden flute, and occasionally he plays simple melodies, folk songs, hymns, tunes that everyone recognizes. The music is sweet and slightly sad, and it fills the stone room with something beyond the usual sounds of coughing and shuffling feet. For a few minutes, you're all just people listening to music, connected by something other than disease. But there are also tensions, of course. Confined quarters breed disputes. There are arguments over small things. Who took whose blanket, who didn't do their share of work, who received more alms and might be hiding coins. The hospital master mediates these conflicts with varying degrees of patience. The rules are clear, and punishments for breaking them can be harsh. In an environment where everyone is already stripped of so much, the enforcement of order can sometimes feel arbitrary and cruel, but it's also necessary. Without structure, without rules, the community would collapse into chaos. You've also witnessed the progression of the disease in others, and you know what likely awaits you. You've watched as people lost the use of their hands entirely, as their facial features distorted, as they required increasing care. You've seen the ulcers that form on numbed extremities, how they become infected, how sometimes fingers or toes simply fall away, the tissue dead and separating from the body. You've been present when people died, their lungs finally giving out, or an infection overwhelming their weakened systems. The treatments offered are numerous but largely ineffective. The hospital physician, when one visits, might prescribe bloodletting to balance your humors. He might recommend various ointments, compounds of mercury, sulfur or arsenic that burn the skin and accomplish little else. There are herbal preparations to drink, teas made from sarsaparilla or sassafras, believed to purify the blood. Some treatments are based on the doctrine of signatures, the idea that plants resembling diseased tissues might cure them. Others are simply folk remedies, handed down through generations, tried because something must be tried, because the alternative is to do nothing and watch helplessly as the disease advances. The psychological toll of this existence is heavy, though such language would be unfamiliar to you. You experience it simply as a kind of weight, a persistent sadness that colors even moments of relative peace. You mourn your former life constantly, yet you must also find ways to continue, to make meaning within your current circumstances. The religious framework provides some structure for this grief. You are encouraged to see your suffering as redemptive, as a form of participation in Christ's passion. Your earthly pain is purchasing heavenly reward. This theology is both comforting and troubling. It gives purpose to your suffering, but it also implies that your suffering is necessary, even good. Night falls, and the final prayers of Compline are said. The chapel is dark now, lit only by a few candles. The chanting is quieter, the tone solemn. There are prayers for protection through the night, for peaceful rest, for the souls of those who have died. You return to your chamber and lie down on your pallet, pulling the thin blanket over yourself. Sleep comes slowly. The sounds of the hospital at night are familiar now. The coughing, always the coughing, the restless movements of those who cannot find comfortable positions, the occasional cry from the infirmary where someone is in significant pain. Outside, you hear the wind moving through the trees, the distant bark of a dog, the world continuing its business beyond these walls. You think about tomorrow, which will be much like today, and the day after, and the day after that. This is your life now, this narrow round of prayers and simple tasks, of begging and small humiliations, of slow physical decline. But it is still life. You have not been entirely erased. You exist, you endure, and in that endurance there is a kind of quiet dignity, even if the world cannot see it, even if you yourself sometimes struggle to believe in it. Eventually you drift into sleep, and the mercy of unconsciousness releases you, at least for a few hours, from the awareness of all that you have lost and all that still awaits you. Let your breath slow now, and allow your mind to shift from the common leper, whose name history never recorded, to a figure whose story was preserved precisely because of the contradiction he embodied. A king who bore a disease that should have rendered him untouchable, yet who commanded armies and negotiated with sultans while his body slowly failed him. We move eastward now, from the leper houses of Europe to the sun-baked walls of Jerusalem to the fragile Crusader kingdom that clung to the Levantine coast in the late 12th century. Here, in a palace that looked out over the holiest city in Christendom, a boy was growing up who would become one of the most remarkable rulers of the medieval period, though fate had marked him for tragedy before he even understood what kingship meant. Baldwin was born in 1161, the son of Amalric I, king of Jerusalem, and Agnes of Courtenay. His birth was a matter of political significance. The Crusader states desperately needed heirs, needed continuity, needed the promise that the Christian presence in the Holy Land would endure beyond a single generation. He had an older sister, Sibylla, but in this world it was the male child who carried the weight of dynastic expectation. Imagine the boy at 7 or 8 years old, playing in the palace gardens with other children of the court. The Mediterranean sun is warm on your skin, and the air carries the mingled scents of exotic spices from the markets, the salt of the nearby sea, and the dust that seems to permeate everything in this ancient land. You are engaged in some rough game, perhaps mock combat with wooden swords, the boys of the court preparing for their future roles as knights and warriors. But something is wrong, though it takes time for anyone to notice. When the other boys complain of bruises and scrapes from the play fighting, you say nothing. Not because you are braver, but because you don't feel the pain that should accompany the injuries you've sustained. Your tutor, William of Tyre, who will later become your chronicler and the primary source for your story, begins to observe you with growing concern. William describes the discovery in his chronicle, writing with the measured prose of a scholar who is also trying to process what this means for the kingdom he serves. He tests you, pinching your arm, pricking your skin with pins, and you respond with puzzlement rather than pain. You can see what he's doing, but you cannot feel it. The sensation is absent, and in that absence, a terrible understanding begins to dawn. The diagnosis, when it comes, is delivered with the gravity it deserves. Leprosy. The word falls like a stone into still water, and the ripples spread outward, touching everything. You are 9 years old, the heir to the kingdom of Jerusalem, and you have been sentenced to a slow death that will strip away your body piece by piece, while your mind remains clear and aware of every loss. In most circumstances, this would be the end of your political future. A leper could not rule. A leper could not marry and produce heirs. A leper could barely exist within society, let alone at its apex. But you are not in Europe, and the circumstances are not ordinary. The kingdom of Jerusalem is surrounded by Muslim powers, engaged in a constant struggle for survival. Your father, King Amalric, is still alive and ruling, and there is time, perhaps, to manage this catastrophe, to find some solution that will preserve the kingdom's stability. Your father does not immediately set you aside. Perhaps he hopes the diagnosis is wrong, or that the disease will progress slowly enough that alternatives can be found. Perhaps he simply cannot bear to strip his son of his birthright based on a condition that, in its early stages, is not yet incapacitating. So your education continues. You are trained in the arts of war, in diplomacy, in the complex web of relationships and obligations that hold the Crusader states together. You learn Latin and French, study scripture and law, and practice the skills of horsemanship and combat that define the knightly class. William of Tyre, your tutor, watches this process with a mixture of admiration and heartbreak. He will later write that you were intelligent and eager to learn, possessed of a good memory and a strategic mind. He describes you as courageous and determined, qualities that will be tested in ways few rulers ever experience. But underlying every lesson, every accomplishment, is the knowledge of what is coming, the disease that is already at work beneath your skin. In 1174, when you are 13 years old, your father dies unexpectedly while on campaign in Egypt. The succession, despite everything, falls to you. You are crowned Baldwin IV, King of Jerusalem, a boy king who must navigate not only the normal challenges of medieval rulership, but also the progressive betrayal of his own body. The early years of your reign are managed through regents, first Miles of Plancy, who is quickly assassinated, and then Raymond III of Tripoli, a capable nobleman who handles much of the kingdom's administration while you continue your education and training. But you are not content to be a figurehead. Even as a teenager, you insist on learning the craft of kingship, on being present at councils, on understanding the military and political situations that threaten your realm. The great antagonist of your reign is already established by the time you take the throne. Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the Crusaders as Saladin. He is rising to power in Egypt and Syria, uniting the Muslim territories that surround your fragmented kingdom, and he is brilliant. A skilled military commander, a shrewd diplomat, and a man driven by the goal of reclaiming Jerusalem for Islam. You are a teenage leper. He is a mature warrior at the height of his powers. By any reasonable calculation, you should be overwhelmed quickly. But history does not always follow reasonable calculations. As you move through your teenage years, the disease progresses. Your face begins to show the characteristic signs: thickening of the skin, the beginning of nodular formations, a certain mask-like quality that develops as facial nerves are affected. Your hands, always your hands, lose more sensation and dexterity. You must learn to compensate, to hold reins in ways that don't require fine motor control, to wear gloves that both protect your damaged skin and hide the visible effects of the disease. Yet you refuse to withdraw from your duties. In 1177, when you are 16 years old, Saladin invades the kingdom with a large army, confident that the young leper king will be unable to mount an effective defense. He advances through the southern territories, his forces spread out and foraging, seemingly unstoppable. The situation appears desperate. Your military advisors counsel caution, perhaps even retreat to the fortified coastal cities. But you make a different choice. You gather what forces you can, a relatively small army of perhaps 500 knights and a few thousand infantry, and you march south to meet Saladin. Your advisors are horrified. You are outnumbered, inexperienced in command, and physically compromised. But you have also identified an opportunity. Saladin's army is dispersed and overconfident, not expecting serious resistance. At Montgizard near Ramla, you catch Saladin's forces unprepared. The battle that follows is a stunning victory for the Crusaders. The Muslim army is routed, suffering heavy casualties, and Saladin himself barely escapes. You, the 16-year-old leper king, have achieved what seemed impossible, and the victory reverberates throughout the region. It establishes your reputation as a capable military commander and buys your kingdom precious time. Picture yourself in the aftermath of that battle, still mounted, though mounting and dismounting are becoming more difficult, surveying the field. Your body aches in ways you cannot fully feel. A strange disconnect between the exhaustion you logically know you should be experiencing and the numbness that obscures direct sensation. Your face is covered with a veil, a practice you've adopted to spare others the discomfort of looking directly at your increasingly affected features. Around you, your knights are celebrating, energized by the improbable triumph, and you allow yourself a moment of satisfaction. You have proven that you are more than your disease, that you can fulfill the role for which you were born. But the victory cannot halt the progression of your condition. As you move into your late teens and early 20s, the physical decline becomes more pronounced. Your hands curl inward, the fingers stiffening as the disease damages tendons and nerves. Eventually, you lose the use of your hands almost entirely. You can no longer sign documents in the traditional way, and a mechanical stamp is created to mark your seal on official papers. You can no longer hold a sword or control a horse with the precision required for combat. Walking becomes increasingly difficult. The disease affects your feet and legs, creating a shuffling, unsteady gait. Eventually, you must be carried on a litter when you need to move any significant distance. For ceremonial occasions, you are placed on a throne that can be transported, maintaining the visual authority of kingship even as the physical reality crumbles. Your face continues its transformation. The leprosy creates a leonine appearance, a thickening and coarsening of the features that medieval observers found deeply unsettling. You begin to wear veils more consistently, both as a practical matter. Your eyes are becoming affected, vulnerable to dust and light, and as a social accommodation. People struggle to look at you directly, and while this is painful, you also understand it. You've seen your own reflection, watched your face become something almost unrecognizable. Yet through all of this, you continue to rule. The councils of state meet regularly, and you are present, listening, asking questions, making decisions. Your mind remains sharp, perhaps even sharpened by adversity. You understand the precarious nature of your kingdom, wedged between the sea and hostile powers, held together by a combination of military strength, diplomatic maneuvering, and the fractious unity of the Crusader nobility. These nobles are a constant challenge. They are ambitious, often at odds with each other, divided by competing claims and ancient grudges. Your kingdom includes not just Jerusalem, but the county of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and various smaller holdings, each with its own lord who may or may not prioritize the common defense over personal advantage. You must navigate these relationships carefully, balancing power between different factions, using what authority you possess to maintain some semblance of coherent policy. Raymond of Tripoli, your former regent, remains an important figure, and you generally trust his judgment. But there are others, like Renaud of Châtillon, a reckless and aggressive noble who consistently undermines truces with Saladin through raids and provocations, who create constant problems. You lack the physical presence to dominate these men through force of personality alone, yet you find other ways to maintain control, through careful distribution of offices and lands, through alliances with the military orders like the Templars and Hospitallers, through the strategic use of your sister Sibylla's marriage prospects. Sibylla's situation becomes increasingly important as it becomes clear that you will not produce an heir yourself. Her first husband, William of Montferrat, dies in 1177, leaving her with a young son, the future Baldwin V. She is now the key to the succession, and her remarriage is a matter of intense political significance. You eventually consent to her marriage to Guy of Lusignan, a handsome but politically divisive figure. This decision will have profound consequences after your death, but in the moment, it seems like a necessary compromise among difficult options. The chronic nature of your disease creates a particular kind of psychological burden. You are always dying, always declining, yet never quite reaching the end. Each year brings new losses, another ability gone, another part of your body failing. But you continue. There is no sudden crisis to focus the mind, only the slow attrition of everything that makes daily life manageable. Your relationship with physical pain is complex. Leprosy itself is not typically painful in the way that injuries are painful, because it deadens nerves. But the secondary effects, the infections in unnoticed wounds, the pressure ulcers from immobility, the strain on joints from altered gaits, these cause suffering. And there is the psychological pain of watching yourself disappear piece by piece, of knowing that every dawn brings you closer to complete helplessness. The spiritual dimension of your experience is significant, though the sources are frustratingly vague on your personal religious feelings. You live in an intensely religious age and society. Jerusalem is the holiest city in Christianity, the site of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection, and you are its guardian. The Crusades themselves are understood as sacred warfare, and your role is not merely political but theological. You are defending Christendom itself. How do you understand your disease within this framework? Is it divine punishment, as conventional medieval thought might suggest? But punishment for what? You were a child when you contracted it, innocent of any grave sin. Is it a test, like Job's trials, meant to prove your faith and virtue? This interpretation offers more comfort, transforming your suffering into something meaningful. Or is it simply the random cruelty of a fallen world, without particular significance beyond the brute fact of its existence? The sources don't tell us what you believed privately, but they do record your actions. You continue to fulfill your religious duties, attending services when physically possible, supporting the church, endowing monasteries and hospitals. You make pilgrimages to holy sites within your realm when your health permits, and you maintain your role as king, refusing to abdicate, refusing to treat your disease as a reason to abandon your responsibilities. In 1183, when you are 22 years old, your condition deteriorates significantly. You can no longer function as an active military commander. The decision is made to crown your nephew, the young Baldwin V, as co-king, with the understanding that he will succeed you fully at your death. This is both a practical necessity and a heartbreak. You are acknowledging publicly that your reign is ending, that you are becoming, in effect, a living relic. Yet even in this diminished state, you continue to exercise what authority remains to you. When Guy of Lusignan, your sister's husband and now regent for the child king, proves incompetent in a military campaign, you summon the strength to remove him from the regency, replacing him with Raymond of Tripoli. This requires political skill and will, the ability to command respect and obedience despite your physical helplessness. You manage it, demonstrating that kingship is not purely a matter of physical presence, but also of legitimacy, intelligence, and strategic thinking. The final years are the hardest. You are increasingly bedridden, your body wasting away. Blindness comes, not complete perhaps, but significant enough that you must rely on others to describe what is happening around you. You can no longer sign documents or speak clearly for extended periods. Your world shrinks to the room where you lie, and you must trust others to bring you accurate information, to carry out your instructions, to govern in your name while you still technically wear the crown. There are moments of lucidity and moments when the pain or fever clouds your thinking. The treatments continue, the bloodletting, the ointments, the herbal preparations, not because anyone believes they will cure you, but because doing nothing seems like abandonment. The physicians who attend you are helpless before the disease's progression, but they maintain the rituals of their profession, and perhaps that provides some psychological comfort to those around you, if not to you yourself. Your relationship with Saladin during these years is complex. He is your enemy, certainly, the man who seeks to destroy your kingdom and reclaim Jerusalem for Islam. But there is also a mutual respect that develops, an acknowledgement of each other's capabilities and honor. Truces are negotiated and sometimes kept. Messages are exchanged through intermediaries. When you are too ill to take the field personally, Saladin appears to modify his strategy, perhaps understanding that attacking while you are completely helpless might undermine his reputation for chivalry and honor. The Muslim sources offer their own perspective on you. They note your youth, your affliction, and your courage. Some express a kind of pity mixed with admiration. You are, in their accounts, a tragic figure, a worthy adversary brought low by disease rather than honorable combat. This is perhaps cold comfort, but it suggests that your struggle to maintain dignity and authority despite your condition was recognized even by your enemies. In the spring of 1185, as the season turns and Jerusalem begins to warm, you reach the end. You are 24 years old, and you have been king for 11 years, battling both Saladin and your own disintegrating body. The exact circumstances of your death are not dramatically recorded. There is no great final battle, no stirring deathbed speech that the chroniclers preserved. You simply reach the point where your body can no longer sustain life, where the accumulated damage from the disease and its complications overwhelms your system. William of Tyre, your old tutor, has predeceased you, so he cannot write your obituary. But other chroniclers record your passing with a mixture of sorrow and relief. Sorrow because you had proven yourself a capable and courageous king under impossible circumstances. Relief because your death finally ends years of political uncertainty and allows the succession to proceed cleanly, or so they hope. In reality, the succession will be disastrous, leading within a few years to the loss of Jerusalem itself in 1187. But that is beyond your knowledge as you slip away. Your body is buried in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the holiest site in Jerusalem, near the tomb of Christ himself. This is a significant honor, and it speaks to how you were regarded despite your disease. You are interred not in some separate place, not in a leper cemetery, but in the heart of Christian sacred geography. In death, if not fully in life, you are restored to your proper place in the hierarchy of power and sanctity. The legacy of your reign is debated among historians. Some emphasize your military victories, particularly Montgisard, and your success in keeping Saladin at bay for years despite overwhelming odds. Others focus on the political instability that your condition created, the succession crisis that ultimately contributed to the kingdom's collapse. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of your story is simply the fact that you reigned at all, that you refused to let your disease define the entirety of your identity or capacity. You were a leper, yes, but you were also a king, a military commander, a political strategist, and a human being who continued to fight for dignity and purpose, even as your body betrayed you in the most profound ways. The contradiction of your existence, untouchable yet commanding, isolated by disease yet central to the fate of kingdoms, makes your story both tragic and inspiring. He chose to continue, and in that choice there is something worth remembering, something that transcends the specific circumstances of medieval leprosy and speaks to the broader human experience of living with limitation, with loss, with the knowledge that our bodies will eventually fail us, but that we retain, almost until the very end, some capacity for decision, for meaning-making, for dignity. Let that thought settle gently in your mind as we prepare to move forward, from biography to archaeology, from the story of one remarkable individual to the physical traces that remain of the communities where ordinary lepers lived out their days. Allow your mind to shift now, to drift forward through the centuries. The leper hospitals have long since crumbled, their residents gone to dust, their stories mostly forgotten. But the ground remembers. Beneath parking lots and farm fields, under the foundations of modern buildings, the physical evidence of medieval leprosy remains, waiting for archaeologists with their careful tools and patient methods to bring it back into the light. We move into the realm of archaeological discovery now, where spades and brushes reveal what written documents often omit. The material reality of disease, the actual bones of people who lived and died with leprosy, the medical instruments and treatments that were tried, the spatial organization of communities built around isolation and care. This is history written in soil layers and skeletal remains, in pottery shards and architectural foundations, in the silent testimony of physical evidence. Imagine yourself at an excavation site somewhere in England, perhaps in the countryside, near a town that has existed since medieval times. The year is recent, perhaps the 1990s or early 2000s, when commercial development has necessitated an archaeological survey before construction can proceed. The site has been identified from historical records as the location of a medieval leper hospital, though nothing visible remains above ground. The buildings were abandoned centuries ago, perhaps as early as the 16th century, when leprosy began to decline in Europe, and time has erased them from the landscape. The excavation begins with careful removal of topsoil, exposing the features beneath. Gradually, the outline of buildings emerges, darker soil where posts once stood, lines of stone foundation, the rectangular depression that marks where a chapel stood. The archaeologists work slowly, recording everything, photographing each layer, collecting soil samples for later analysis. They are reconstructing not just a place, but a community, trying to understand how people lived within these walls. One of the most significant discoveries at any leper hospital excavation is the cemetery. Medieval leper hospitals maintained their own burial grounds, as the residents could not be interred in regular parish churchyards. These cemeteries offer archaeologists a unique opportunity to study the skeletal evidence of leprosy directly, to see what the disease actually did to human bodies, to move beyond the literary descriptions and artistic representations to the physical reality. The burials are typically simple. Most lepers died with few possessions, and the graves reflect this poverty. Bodies are laid out in standard Christian fashion, east-west orientation, hands folded or crossed on the chest, no grave goods beyond perhaps a simple shroud or wooden coffin, but the bones themselves tell elaborate stories. Leprosy, or Hansen's disease as it's properly called now, is caused by Mycobacterium leprae, a bacterium related to the one that causes tuberculosis. This microbial fact was unknown to medieval people, but its effects were all too visible. The bacterium primarily affects the peripheral nervous system, the skin, and the mucous membranes of the upper respiratory tract. Over time, usually many years, it causes the characteristic symptoms that medieval people feared: loss of sensation, skin lesions, deformities, and eventually, in severe cases, significant bone changes. The skeletal evidence reveals these changes in permanent form. Archaeologists examining the bones from leper hospital cemeteries find specific diagnostic patterns. The facial bones show particular alterations, the nasal spine resorbs, creating a characteristic flattening of the nasal aperture. The teeth, no longer supported by deteriorating maxillary bone, show patterns of loss from the front of the mouth backward. The palate may be perforated, evidence of the infection spreading through the soft tissues of the nose and mouth. The hands and feet show perhaps the most dramatic changes. The small bones, the metacarpals and metatarsals, the phalanges of fingers and toes, display a distinctive pattern called osteomyelitis, where infection in the soft tissues spreads to the bone itself. In severe cases, the ends of these bones are simply gone, dissolved away by infection. This is what caused the loss of fingers and toes that medieval people observed, the body literally consuming itself from the extremities inward. Picture the archaeologist carefully cleaning a skeleton, brushing away soil with a soft brush, revealing bones that are over 600 years old. The skull emerges first, and immediately the telltale signs are visible. The nasal opening is enlarged and smoothed. The upper jaw shows porosity and bone loss. As they work down the body, the hands reveal missing or shortened finger bones. The feet show similar patterns. This person lived with leprosy for years, probably decades, their body progressively damaged by the disease they could not understand and could not cure. But skeletal evidence also reveals something else, that many people buried in leper hospital cemeteries did not actually have leprosy. Studies of cemetery populations show that perhaps only 60 to 70% of the individuals show the diagnostic skeletal changes of the disease. The others died of different causes or had leprosy that hadn't progressed far enough to affect their bones, or had some other condition that medieval diagnostics couldn't distinguish from leprosy. This finding illuminates an important aspect of medieval medicine. Diagnosis was imperfect, based on external observation and limited understanding of disease causation. The tests used to diagnose leprosy, as described in medical texts, included examining the skin for discoloration and nodules, testing for loss of sensation with pins or hot irons, checking whether the patient's blood sank or floated in water, observing changes in the voice or facial appearance. Some of these tests were reasonably accurate for advanced leprosy, but they would also yield false positives for other conditions. People might be diagnosed with leprosy when they actually had vitiligo, a skin condition causing loss of pigmentation, or lupus, which can create facial lesions, or any number of other dermatological conditions that medieval medicine lacked the tools to distinguish. Once diagnosed, once sent to the leper house, the person lived out their days with that identity regardless of what was actually wrong with them. The archaeological evidence of non-leprous skeletons in leper hospital cemeteries is a sobering reminder of this diagnostic imprecision. The excavations also reveal the physical layout of these institutions, and from that layout, we can infer something about how they functioned. Most leper hospitals follow a similar plan. A chapel as the central feature, dormitory buildings arranged around a courtyard, a refectory for communal meals, an infirmary for the severely ill, and often a gatehouse that controlled access to the complex. The architecture itself enforces the separation from the outside world. Walls surround the compound, and there is typically only one entrance, easily monitored. The buildings are usually modest in scale and construction. Stone foundations supporting wooden superstructures, thatched roofs, beaten earth or simple plank floors. The individual living spaces are small, perhaps 10 feet square, sufficient for a bed and minimal personal possessions. The refectory contains long tables with benches, spaces for communal dining that would have reinforced the quasi-monastic character of these communities. Archaeological work at the site of St. Mary Magdalene Hospital near Winchester, England, has been particularly revealing. Excavations in the 1980s and later uncovered not just the chapel and cemetery, but also evidence of the hospital's daily life. Pottery fragments showing what vessels were used for cooking and eating, animal bones indicating what meat was consumed, metal objects including pins, buckles, and the occasional knife or tool. These mundane objects create a material context for the lives we've already explored, giving physical form to the daily routines of prayer, work, and survival. One particularly poignant find from various excavations is children's bones in leper hospital cemeteries. Leprosy could affect children, though it was less common than in adults. But these small skeletons raise difficult questions. Were these children born to lepers within the hospital? Were they brought there after diagnosis? How did a community of diseased adults care for afflicted children? The bones cannot answer these questions directly, but they confirm that the experience of medieval leprosy was not limited to adults, that families were sometimes torn apart by the disease affecting multiple members, and that childhood in a leper hospital was a reality for some unfortunate few. The excavations also sometimes reveal evidence of violence or trauma on the skeletal remains. Healed fractures, weapon wounds, signs of chronic malnutrition. These findings complicate the picture of leper hospitals as purely places of refuge. Life within these institutions could be harsh. Residents might fight among themselves. The enforcers of hospital rules might use physical punishment. And some residents came to the leper house already bearing the marks of violence from their lives before diagnosis, when they might have been attacked by fearful neighbors or injured in the chaos of medieval life. Now let us turn to the written medical texts that complemented the physical reality revealed by archaeology. Medieval medicine was a complex system drawing on ancient Greek and Roman sources, particularly the works of Galen and Hippocrates, filtered through centuries of Islamic medical scholarship and then translated into Latin for European practitioners. Medical knowledge was theoretical and observational, lacking the microscopes and experimental methods that would eventually reveal the true nature of disease. Leprosy features prominently in medieval medical literature, and the texts reveal both genuine observation and profound misunderstanding. The most sophisticated medical writings of the period came from university-trained physicians, men who had studied at places like Salerno, Montpellier, or Bologna, where medical education was becoming increasingly formalized. These physicians understood disease through the theory of humors, the idea that health depended on the proper balance of 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Leprosy was typically attributed to an excess or corruption of black bile, the melancholic humor, which was cold and dry. This explained to the medieval mind why leprosy seemed to dry out and darken the skin, why it created the melancholic temperament often observed in lepers. The texts describe leprosy in considerable detail, categorizing it into different types. Some authorities distinguished between leonine leprosy, where the face took on a lion-like appearance with thickening and coarsening of features; serpentine leprosy, characterized by scaly skin lesions; and elephantine leprosy, marked by thickened, rough skin resembling an elephant's hide. These categories mixed genuine observation with fanciful association, creating a taxonomy that was more poetic than accurate. Diagnostic texts recommended examining the patient thoroughly. The physician should observe the patient's complexion, noting any unusual pallor or darkening. He should examine the skin for nodules, lesions, or areas of discoloration. He should test for loss of sensation, pricking the suspect areas with needles to see if the patient responded. The quality of the voice was considered important. Leprosy was believed to create a hoarse, rough voice as it affected the throat and nasal passages. One diagnostic test involved taking a sample of the patient's blood and placing it in water to see whether it sank or floated. The logic here, if it can be called that, was based on humoral theory. Corrupted blood would be heavier with black bile and would sink. Another test involved examining the patient's urine, which was central to medieval diagnostic practice. The color, clarity, and sediment of urine were believed to reveal the state of the patient's internal humors and the nature of any disease. Imagine yourself as a medieval physician, called to examine someone suspected of having leprosy. You arrive with your medical texts, your instruments, your authority granted by university training. The patient sits before you, anxious, knowing that your diagnosis will determine their entire future. You conduct your examination methodically, following the procedures outlined in your texts. You observe the skin, prick with needles, collect blood and urine samples. You ask questions about symptoms, about family history, about the patient's occupation and habits. But underneath your professional demeanor, you are also afraid. You know that leprosy is considered contagious, though the understanding of contagion is vague and confused. Medieval people believed disease could spread through bad air, through physical contact, through the gaze of an infected person, through sexual intercourse, through shared food or drink. Leprosy's slow progression made its transmission patterns difficult to discern, leading to both overestimation and underestimation of the risk. If you diagnose leprosy, you are not just identifying a disease. You are condemning this person to social death, to separation from family, to confinement in a leper house. The weight of this responsibility is considerable, though your culture tells you that it is necessary for the protection of the community. Better one person should suffer isolation than that the disease should spread through the population. Once diagnosed, the medieval leper might be subjected to various treatments, all of them ineffective against the actual bacterial infection, but reflective of the medical theories of the time. Bloodletting was common, intended to remove excess or corrupted blood and rebalance the humors. The physician would open a vein, usually in the arm, and allow blood to flow into a bowl until he judged that sufficient quantity had been removed. This procedure, far from helping, likely weakened patients who were already struggling with a chronic infection. Dietary recommendations were also common. Since leprosy was associated with black bile, foods believed to produce this humor should be avoided. Melons, cucumbers, and other cold and moist foods were prohibited. Instead, the patient should consume foods considered hot and dry, peppers, wine, roasted meats. These dietary restrictions had no effect on the disease but may have affected overall nutrition, for better or worse, depending on the specific recommendations. Topical treatments were numerous and often elaborate. Medical texts describe ointments made from extraordinary combinations of ingredients. Mercury, which is actually toxic, sulfur, which creates a burning sensation, various plant extracts, animal fats as a base. One recipe from a medieval text calls for mixing viper's flesh with specific herbs, grinding them together and applying them to the lesions. The logic here drew on the doctrine of signatures and the idea of sympathetic magic. The snake, which sheds its skin, might help the patient shed their diseased skin. Other treatments were even more exotic. Some texts recommend bathing in blood, particularly the blood of young virgins or infants, based on an ancient belief that such blood retained vital force that might counteract the corruption of leprosy. There is debate among historians about whether such treatments were actually performed or were merely theoretical recommendations that appeared in texts but not in practice. The archaeological record cannot answer this question, as blood leaves no trace after centuries in the ground. Herbal treatments were more practical and more commonly used. Plants like sarsaparilla, sassafras, and various local herbs were brewed into teas or decoctions. Some of these plants do have mild antiseptic or anti-inflammatory properties, though nothing that would combat the bacterial infection itself. But the act of treatment, the ritual of preparation and administration, provided psychological comfort to both practitioner and patient, a sense that something was being done, that the situation was not entirely hopeless. The medical texts also reveal the ways that leprosy was understood morally and theologically, not just physically. Many manuscripts include discussions of whether leprosy is punishment for sin, and the answers are more nuanced than we might expect. Some authorities argue yes, pointing to biblical precedents like Miriam's leprosy in the Book of Numbers or Gehazi in 2 Kings, both punished with the disease for specific transgressions. But other authorities argue against this simple equation, noting that innocent people, including children, contracted the disease, and that Christ himself touched and healed lepers, suggesting they were not universally sinful. This theological debate had practical implications. If leprosy was divine punishment, then lepers deserved their fate and were perhaps dangerous moral contaminants as well as physical ones. But if leprosy was simply one of many afflictions that befell humanity in a fallen world, then lepers deserved compassion and care, and serving them became an act of Christian charity that benefited the caregiver's soul. The archaeological evidence from leper hospital chapels suggests that the latter view often prevailed in practice, whatever might be written in theoretical texts. The chapels were not punishment cells, but functioning sacred spaces. Frescoes and architectural details show that these were places where the Christian liturgy was celebrated, where lepers participated in the sacraments, where they were incorporated into the community of the faithful, even while being excluded from the broader society. Excavations at some sites have uncovered altar stones still in place, the consecrated tables where Mass was celebrated. Fragments of religious artifacts, pieces of censers for burning incense, chalices and patens for the Eucharist, reliquaries that once held sacred relics, demonstrate that leper hospital chapels were not stripped down. Minimal spaces, but were equipped with the objects necessary for full religious observance. In some cases, archaeological and architectural evidence reveals that leper hospital chapels had special features to accommodate the residents' conditions. Squints, small openings in walls, allowed people who were bedridden in the infirmary to see the altar and observe the Mass from their beds. Low windows permitted those who could not stand for long periods to sit and still see into the chapel. These architectural accommodations suggest a genuine attempt to include lepers in religious life, despite their physical limitations. The excavations also sometimes reveal evidence of medical care spaces within the hospitals. At some sites, archaeologists have found concentrations of certain artifact types that suggest medical activity. Small glass vials that might have contained ointments or medicines. Ceramic vessels of types known to be used for heating water or preparing herbal infusions. Metal instruments that could be surgical tools. The interpretation of these finds requires careful analysis, as similar objects could have other uses, but together they suggest that medical treatment, however ineffective by modern standards, was attempted. One particularly interesting find from excavations in Denmark was a collection of plant remains from a medieval leper hospital, preserved in waterlogged deposits that prevented decay. Analysis revealed species that matched those recommended in medieval medical texts for treating leprosy and other ailments: henbane, hemlock, and various aromatic herbs. This is rare physical confirmation that the treatments described in manuscripts were actually prepared and presumably administered to patients. The study of medieval leprosy has been revolutionized in recent decades by advances in molecular biology. Scientists can now extract DNA from skeletal remains and, under ideal conditions, recover genetic material from Mycobacterium leprae itself. This allows them to confirm diagnoses of leprosy with certainty, to trace the spread of different strains of the bacterium through medieval populations, and to understand the evolutionary history of the disease. Studies of ancient DNA from medieval leper skeletons have revealed that the strains of leprosy circulating in medieval Europe are closely related to strains still found in modern populations in some parts of the world. This suggests that leprosy has been remarkably stable genetically over centuries, evolving slowly compared to some other bacterial diseases. The research also indicates that there were multiple introduction events, with different strains entering Europe at different times, possibly through trade routes and population movements. This molecular evidence complements the archaeological and historical record, creating a more complete picture of medieval leprosy as both a biological and social phenomenon. The bacteria caused real, measurable changes in human bodies. Medieval society responded to these changes with a complex mixture of fear, charity, religious interpretation, and medical intervention. The archaeological sites are where these two aspects, biological and social, intersect and can be studied together. As you consider all this evidence, lying comfortably in your present moment, you might reflect on what archaeology reveals that written sources cannot. The documents tell us what educated, literate people thought about leprosy, how they categorized it, what treatments they recommended, what laws they passed governing lepers. But the bones tell us what actually happened to real human bodies. The excavated buildings show us where people actually lived. The artifacts reveal what they actually used in their daily lives. There is sometimes a gap between prescription and practice, between the ideal described in texts and the reality revealed by excavation. Medical manuscripts describe elaborate diagnostic procedures, but how often were they actually followed? Regulations specify that lepers must wear identifying clothing and carry warning devices, but the archaeological evidence cannot confirm that every individual complied. Hospital rules prohibit certain behaviors, but the material evidence sometimes suggests those prohibitions were violated. The archaeology of medieval leprosy is still ongoing. Sites continue to be excavated, new analytical techniques are applied to existing collections, and our understanding evolves. Each excavation adds data points, each skeleton tells a story, each artifact provides context. Together, they create a picture that is increasingly detailed and nuanced, moving beyond the simple stereotypes of the loathsome leper to the complex reality of people living with a disease that isolated them, but did not entirely erase their humanity. Let these images settle in your mind now. The careful work of excavation, the bones emerging from the soil, the fragments of pottery and metal that speak of daily life, the chapel foundations outlining a space of worship and hope. History is not just written in documents, but is buried in the ground, waiting to be rediscovered, interpreted, and integrated into our understanding of the past. The light is fading now, and you can feel yourself drifting deeper into this historical landscape. Let your breathing slow further and allow your mind to shift once more. We have spent time among the common lepers, in the crowded lazar houses where poverty and disease intertwined. We have walked with a leper king through the palaces of Jerusalem. We have sifted through archaeological remains, touching the physical traces of lives long ended. Now we turn to a final aspect of this story, the experience of those who contracted leprosy but possessed wealth, status, and the resources to shape their affliction differently. Medieval society was profoundly hierarchical. Your position at birth largely determined your position at death, and the vast machinery of social organization worked to maintain these distinctions. But disease, in its democratic cruelty, could strike anyone. When leprosy afflicted someone of wealth or noble birth, the response was different from the summary exile imposed on peasants and artisans. Money and status could not cure the disease, but they could significantly alter how it was experienced and managed. Imagine yourself born into a merchant family in a prosperous Italian city-state, perhaps Florence or Venice in the 14th century. Your family's wealth comes from trade, from banking, from the complex financial instruments that fuel the commercial revolution of the late Middle Ages. You have been educated, you can read Latin and vernacular languages, you understand accounts and contracts. You were being groomed to take over the family business, to expand its reach, to make advantageous marriages and political alliances. Then in your early 20s, you notice the first signs. Perhaps it begins with a patch of skin on your arm that feels different, slightly numb. You ignore it at first, attributing it to some minor injury you don't recall. But the patch persists, and gradually other symptoms appear. A slight thickening of your facial features, a nodule on your ear, the beginning of that characteristic loss of sensation that you've learned from your study of medical texts to associate with leprosy. You consult a physician privately, paying well for discretion. He conducts his examination behind closed doors, in your family's palazzo, away from public eyes. The diagnosis, when it comes, is delivered gently but firmly. You have contracted leprosy, but unlike the poor laborer or the rural peasant, you have options beyond the public lazar house. Your family, horrified but pragmatic, begins to make arrangements. They cannot hide your condition indefinitely. Medieval cities are too full of eyes, too dense with observation and gossip. But they can manage the revelation, control the narrative, and most importantly, ensure that you are not simply cast out to beg at the city gates or confined to a common leper hospital where the conditions are grim and the company indiscriminate. First, there are legal considerations. Your family consults with notaries and lawyers to ensure that your property rights are protected. Unlike a common leper who is legally dead upon diagnosis, your family's influence means that arrangements can be made. Your assets are transferred to a trust that will support you during your isolation. You retain some legal standing, some claim to your inheritance, though you can no longer actively participate in business affairs or appear in public spaces. The family purchases a small property outside the city, not so far as to be inaccessible, but sufficiently distant to satisfy the requirement that lepers live apart from the healthy population. This is not a lazar house, but a private residence, a modest villa with its own grounds, surrounded by walls that provide privacy as much as containment. The property includes a main house with several rooms, a small chapel or oratory, a garden, and quarters for servants. Yes, servants, this is perhaps the most significant difference between your experience and that of common lepers. You are wealthy enough to employ people to care for you, to cook your meals, to maintain your residence, to serve as intermediaries between you and the outside world. These servants are carefully selected, typically people who have already been exposed to leprosy through family members, or who are desperate enough for employment that they'll accept the risk. They are paid well, better than they would earn in ordinary service, compensation for the danger and the social stigma of working for a leper. Your days in this private exile follow a different rhythm than those in the communal lazar house. You wake in your own chamber, in a proper bed with clean linens that are changed regularly. The room is furnished comfortably. A chest for your clothing, a table and chair for reading and writing, perhaps tapestries on the walls to keep out drafts and provide visual interest. If the season permits, windows can be opened to let in fresh air and sunlight. A servant brings you breakfast, not the thin porridge of the lazar house, but a meal appropriate to your station. bread of good quality, perhaps some cheese or cold meat, wine diluted with water or a breakfast ale. You eat using proper utensils, from dishes that are yours alone, in a setting that maintains the dignity of your former life as much as possible. After breakfast, you might spend time in your private chapel. A priest comes regularly, perhaps weekly, perhaps more often depending on arrangements your family has made, to say Mass and hear your confession. This is a significant expense, as most priests are reluctant to minister to lepers, and those willing to do so command premium payments. But your family can afford it, and ensuring your spiritual care is both a comfort to you and a demonstration of their continued commitment to your welfare. The morning might be spent in quiet activities. You have books, Latin texts if you're educated, perhaps some romances or devotional literature in the vernacular. Reading is one of the few pleasures that the disease doesn't immediately strip away, though eventually, if the leprosy affects your eyes or your hands become too damaged to hold a book properly, even this will be compromised. But for now, you can lose yourself in stories, in philosophical treatises, in the lives of the saints. You might also maintain correspondence, dictating letters to a scribe if your hands are too affected to write yourself. Your family keeps you informed of business matters, political developments, family news. These letters are a lifeline, maintaining your connection to the world beyond your walls. You learn of marriages and births, of deaths and scandals, of the rise and fall of fortunes in the ever-shifting landscape of urban politics and commerce. You cannot participate directly, but you are not entirely cut off. The garden provides another refuge. Unlike the communal residents of Lazar houses, who must share limited outdoor space, you have your own grounds to move through. The garden is planted with both practical herbs for cooking and medicine, and ornamental plants for beauty and fragrance. You can walk the paths, sit in the shade of fruit trees, watch the seasons change in the flowering and fruiting cycles. There is something particularly poignant about tending a garden when you have leprosy. The plants grow, bloom, fruit, and die according to their natural cycles, indifferent to your condition. You plant seeds in spring, knowing you may not live to see them mature, yet the act of planting itself is hopeful, an assertion of continuity and care. Your damaged hands, clumsy and increasingly numb, still can perform some tasks, scattering seeds, pulling large weeds, directing servants in the heavier work. Meals throughout the day are substantial and varied. Your family ensures that provisions are delivered regularly. Meat, fish, vegetables, fruits, the kinds of foods that demonstrate status and provide adequate nutrition. The medieval wealthy ate differently from the poor, with more protein, more variety, more flavor from expensive spices. Your illness doesn't change this. If anything, there may be a conscious effort to maintain your strength through good food, and perhaps an element of compensation, a way of showing love and care when physical contact is impossible. You are not entirely isolated from human contact. Your family visits, though the visits follow strict protocols. They might speak to you through a window or from a distance in the garden, close enough to converse but not to touch. Your mother might come once a week, standing on the far side of the garden wall, calling up to where you sit on a bench. She updates you on family matters, on the marriages being arranged for your siblings, on business successes and challenges. There is so much that cannot be said. The grief of separation, the fear of your deterioration, the guilt that perhaps they feel at their relief that they are healthy while you are not. These visits are both comfort and torment. You see the faces you love, hear the voices that once filled your daily life, but the gulf between you is unbridgeable. When your mother leaves, you watch her walk away, and the loneliness that follows is acute. You are surrounded by servants, but they are paid companions, not family, not friends. The isolation is psychological as much as physical. Some wealthy lepers maintained even more elaborate arrangements. If the family was extremely rich and well-connected, they might establish a small private hospital with a few other residents, carefully selected from families of similar status. This created a kind of elite leper community where people of similar background could live together in greater comfort than the common lazar houses provided. Such establishments might be endowed by the family, with lands or investments providing ongoing income to support operations. There would be a steward to manage the household, servants for cooking and cleaning, perhaps a resident physician who visited regularly. The residents would have private chambers, but could gather in common rooms for meals and socializing. This arrangement provided companionship without the complete loss of privacy, creating a middle ground between total isolation and the crowded conditions of public leper hospitals. In these elite communities, the residents might engage in activities that were impossible for common lepers. If their hands retained sufficient function, they might play musical instruments, lutes, viols, even keyboard instruments like the small portable organs of the period. Music was a valued accomplishment among the wealthy, and maintaining this skill provided both personal satisfaction and a way to mark time, to structure the day, to create beauty in circumstances that were increasingly marked by physical decay. They might engage in games, chess, tables, backgammon, card games that were becoming popular in the late medieval period. These activities required mental acuity, but not physical exertion, and they provided social interaction, friendly competition, and intellectual stimulation. The archaeological record occasionally reveals gaming pieces from higher status leper establishments, elaborately carved chess pieces, decorated dice, fragments of playing cards, evidence that leisure and play continued even in these communities of the afflicted. The medical care available to wealthy lepers was more extensive than what common lepers received, though not necessarily more effective. A wealthy family could afford to consult multiple physicians, to purchase expensive medicinal ingredients, to try every recommended treatment no matter the cost. Your family might import rare substances, theriac from Venice, believed to be a universal antidote, unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, thought to have purifying properties, bezoar stones from the stomachs of ruminants, credited with magical healing powers. None of these worked, of course. Leprosy is a bacterial infection, and nothing in the medieval pharmacopoeia could effectively treat it. But the attempt itself mattered, psychologically to you and socially, as a demonstration of your family's continued commitment and their resources. They were doing everything possible, sparing no expense, fulfilling their duty to you, even though you could no longer contribute to the family's fortunes. The treatments might be more frequent and more varied than those available in lazar houses. Regular bloodletting by a university-trained physician rather than a barber surgeon. Baths prepared with expensive herbs and oils. Ointments compounded from elaborate recipes requiring dozens of ingredients. Special diets designed according to the latest medical theories. None of this halted the disease's progression, but it filled time, provided structure, and maintained hope that perhaps the next treatment might work. There were also religious interventions available to the wealthy. Your family might fund special masses said for your healing, hire priests to pray continuously on your behalf, purchase indulgences that reduced your time in purgatory, commission religious artwork for your private chapel. They might arrange for relics to be brought to you, a fragment of bone from a saint known for healing, a piece of cloth that had touched a holy image, water from a miraculous spring. These items were expensive and required church connections to obtain, but wealth could make such things possible. Pilgrimages were generally impossible for diagnosed lepers, but your family might send representatives on pilgrimage on your behalf to pray at shrines known for healing miracles. Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, the various shrines of the Virgin Mary scattered across Europe. They would carry letters detailing your condition, would present offerings at the shrines, would collect holy water or blessed tokens to bring back to you. This proxy spirituality was an accepted practice, a way of accessing divine mercy when you couldn't travel yourself. Yet despite all these advantages, The comfortable housing, the good food, the medical care, the maintained social connections, you still had leprosy. Your body still betrayed you progressively. The loss of sensation still spread. The deformities still developed. The social stigma still existed. Wealth could cushion the experience, but couldn't fundamentally change it. There were particular frustrations that came with being a wealthy leper. You had been educated, trained, given responsibilities and expectations. You had a role to play in your family's continued success and status. All of that was stripped away by the diagnosis. You went from being an active participant in your world to being a spectator, receiving news of events you once would have helped shape. Your siblings took over the business roles you would have filled. Marriages you might have made were contracted by others. Properties you would have managed passed to different hands. You watched your life, or the life you should have lived, continue without you. The wealth that cushioned your physical circumstances couldn't ease the psychological pain of this displacement. There was also the knowledge that your comfortable situation was precarious, dependent on your family's continued prosperity and goodwill. If the business failed, if political fortunes shifted, if family relationships deteriorated, your support could evaporate. You had seen this happen to others, wealthy lepers whose families eventually tired of the expense, or who lost their fortunes and could no longer maintain private arrangements. Those individuals ended up in common lazar houses after all, experiencing the double shock of both disease and downward social mobility. As your condition progressed, the quality of your life deteriorated, regardless of the resources available. Eventually, you might lose the ability to read as your eyes failed, to walk in your garden as your feet became too damaged, to enjoy music as your hearing was affected, to taste your expensive meals as the disease affected your palate and sense of smell. The privileges of wealth could delay some of these losses, but couldn't prevent them. In the final stages, as you became bedridden, your existence might not differ much from that of a common leper in a hospital infirmary. You would require constant care, feeding, cleaning, turning to prevent bed sores, medication for pain. Your servants might perform these tasks rather than fellow residents, and your room might be more comfortable. But the fundamental reality of helplessness and physical deterioration was the same. Some wealthy lepers made elaborate preparations for death. They commissioned tombs for themselves, sometimes in family burial grounds, despite the usual prohibition on lepers being buried in consecrated ground. Money and influence could sometimes bend these rules, securing a place in the family vault or at least in a church cemetery, rather than the separate leper burial grounds. They made detailed wills, distributing what property they retained to family members, charitable institutions, and the church, trying to secure their spiritual legacy even as their physical presence was erased. Others endowed perpetual masses for their souls, funding priests to say prayers for their salvation in perpetuity. They might establish charitable foundations, creating lazar houses for poor lepers as a way of atoning for their own relatively privileged suffering. Some used their wealth to commission artwork or manuscript illuminations, leaving behind beautiful objects that would outlast their deteriorating bodies, a kind of immortality through patronage. The historical record preserves some names of wealthy lepers, unlike the anonymous poor who filled the common lazar houses. We know of merchants who contracted leprosy and lived out their days in private establishments. We know of minor nobles who were quietly separated from court and settled on remote estates. We know of ecclesiastics, priests, monks, even the occasional bishop, who developed leprosy and were moved to special accommodations where they could continue some religious duties while being isolated from their communities. These individuals left wills, property transactions, letters, and occasional mentions in chronicles. They had lives before leprosy that were documented, and their disease became part of a recorded history rather than vanishing into obscurity. This historical visibility is itself a function of wealth and status. Poor lepers are known to us primarily through statistics, through lists of residents in hospital records, through archaeological remains. Wealthy lepers appear as individuals with names, relationships, and personal histories. But we should be cautious about assuming that wealth made the experience of leprosy somehow acceptable or bearable. Comfort is relative, and the absolute losses were the same regardless of station. Whether you ate plain porridge or roasted meat, you still watched your body decay. Whether you slept on a pallet or a feather bed, you still woke to the reality of your condition. Whether you were surrounded by fellow patients or paid servants, you were still fundamentally isolated from the life you once knew. Perhaps the wealthy leper faced a particular kind of psychological burden, the knowledge of what could have been, the specific life trajectory that was interrupted. The poor peasant diagnosed with leprosy lost a hard life of labor, certainly, but perhaps also accepted this as another misfortune in an existence already marked by uncertainty and hardship. The wealthy leper lost a life of privilege, opportunity, and power. The contrast between what was and what might have been was sharper, more defined, more cruel in its specificity. As you lie here in your comfortable present, considering these wealthy lepers in their private villas and elite communities, you might reflect on the nature of privilege in the face of mortality and disease. Wealth can buy many things: comfort, care, dignity, privacy. But it cannot buy health when health has been fundamentally compromised. It cannot buy back the life that existed before diagnosis. It cannot eliminate the fear of deterioration, the loneliness of isolation, or the existential confrontation with suffering and death. The medieval world understood this in its own terms. The great leveling power of death was a constant theme in art and literature, the dance of death where skeletons lead away pope and peasant alike. The tomb sculptures showing the deceased both as they were in life and as they would become in death, a rotting corpse. Leprosy was, in a sense, a living version of this leveling. It reduced all its victims eventually to the same state of decay, regardless of the circumstances of their suffering. Yet the medieval world also maintained its hierarchies even in disease, because to collapse those hierarchies would threaten the entire social order. Wealthy lepers had to be accommodated differently, not just out of compassion, but out of necessity. To preserve the fiction that status mattered, that rank had meaning, that the social structure was more fundamental than the biological reality of disease. Let these thoughts drift now, settling like sediment in your mind. We have traveled through multiple perspectives on medieval leprosy: the common sufferer, the leper king, the archaeological evidence, the privileged invalid. Together, these views create a composite picture of a disease that was both universal in its effects and deeply particular in how it was experienced, shaped by the circumstances of individual lives and the structures of medieval society. Your breathing is slow now, deep and regular. The stories are winding down, the details becoming less distinct, the medieval world fading back into the past where it belongs. You are safe in your present, free from the diseases and stigmas that haunted those distant people, able to observe their suffering from a comfortable remove. We have traveled far this evening, you and I, from the darkness of a kitchen slave's pre-dawn awakening to the lamplit elegance of an aristocratic triclinium, from the practical mysteries of garum production to the exotic strangeness of flamingo tongues, from Apicius's obsessive experiments to the stark social contrasts that underlay every Roman meal. Roman cuisine, as we have seen, was something remarkable, sophisticated, creative, ambitious in its flavors and techniques. It drew on resources from across an empire, combining ingredients and methods from dozens of cultures into something distinctly Roman. It produced dishes that were genuinely delicious, sauces that were complex and subtle, preparations that influenced cooking for centuries after Rome itself fell. But it was also built on a foundation of inequalities so profound that we struggle to fully comprehend it. Every meal, every sauce, every elaborately prepared dish required labor that we now take for granted in history. The labor of people who had no choice, no freedom, no share in what they created. This tension, this coexistence of achievement and exploitation, is perhaps the most important lesson we can take from our journey tonight. History is not simple. The past is not a morality play with clear heroes and villains. It is complex and contradictory, capable of producing both beauty and brutality, often in the same moment, sometimes in the same meal. The Roman world has long since faded. The villas are ruins, the elaborate tricliniums are archaeological sites, the kitchens are silent. The people who populated our story, the slaves who labored, the cooks who created, the aristocrats who reclined and consumed, are all gone, their lives lived and finished 2,000 years ago. What remains are fragments, recipes in ancient texts, residues in cooking vessels, bones in cemeteries, garum amphorae on the seafloor, and the stories we piece together from these scattered remnants. But from these fragments, we can still learn. We can still appreciate the creativity and skill that went into Roman cooking. We can still marvel at their willingness to experiment, to combine flavors in unexpected ways, to push the boundaries of what food could be. And we can also remember the cost, the human price paid for culinary excellence, the thousands of anonymous laborers whose suffering made possible the legendary feasts of Rome. As you drift now towards sleep, let these thoughts settle gently. Let the images we have created together, the smoke-filled kitchen, Apicius sailing for prawns, the mysterious fermentation of garum, the careful choreography of the triclinium, let them fade into comfortable distance. They are history now, interesting perhaps, informative certainly, but not urgent, not demanding. They belong to the past, and the past is a place we can visit in our minds, but where we do not live. You are here, in the present, in comfort and safety, far removed from Roman kitchens and Roman hierarchies. The food you eat tomorrow will not require 30 slaves to prepare. The meals you enjoy will not come at such human cost. The world has changed, imperfectly perhaps, incompletely certainly, but meaningfully nonetheless. So rest now, let your breath slow and deepen, let your thoughts wander and dissipate. Let the weight of history, interesting as it is, slip away into the gentle darkness. Sleep well, and when you wake, you will remember this journey through ancient Rome's kitchens, but it will feel distant and dreamlike, a story rather than a place, fascinating but safely contained in the past where it belongs. The ancient Roman chefs, the slaves who worked in suffering, the aristocrats who reclined in luxury, they have all departed. Their story is told, for tonight at least, and you can rest, knowing that you have visited their world, learned from their experience, and returned safely to your own time. Good night.